History tells us that lines on a map define a kingdom, but it is the lines on a blueprint that define a prison. For 300 years, the royal palace of Spain, the imposing El Escorial, stood as a monument to God and King. Historians walked its halls. Kings slept in its chambers. Tourists marveled at its art. They believed they knew every inch of its stone skeleton. They were wrong. In 2018, during a structural renovation, modern ground-penetrating radar was used to scan the thick granite foundations of the palace's oldest wing. The lasers mapped every corridor, every servant's tunnel, and every royal crypt. But when the digital map was rendered, the architects froze. Deep within the western wall, sandwiched between the king's personal chapel and the wine cellar, the computer revealed a void. A rectangular space, 10 feet by 10 feet. It was not a ventilation shaft. It was not a mistake in the masonry. It was a room. But as the architects cross-referenced the original blueprints from the 17th century, they found something that made their blood run cold. On the original paper, the space was drawn as solid stone. But the radar does not lie. The room existed. And the most terrifying detail was not the room itself, but the access to it. There was no door. There was no hallway. There was no hatch. The scans revealed a chamber that had been built, finished, and then instantly sealed off from the world while the mortar was still wet. And in the center of that sealed box, the thermal imaging picked up the heat signature of decayed organic matter scratches on the stone floor, and a small, child-sized chair that had sat in total darkness for 3 centuries. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. Let the harsh light of the modern world fade away, replaced by the flickering amber glow of 1,000 beeswax candles. The air grows cool and still. The noise of the city retreats, leaving only the sound of the wind howling across the Spanish plains and the soft, rhythmic scratching of a quill against parchment. We are drifting back to a time of velvet and iron, of golden crosses and dark shadows. Close your eyes and imagine you are standing before the heavy, iron-bound gates of the royal site of San Lorenzo del Escorial. It is night. The moon hangs high and pale above the Guadarrama Mountains, casting long silver fingers across the granite facade of the palace. This is not merely a home for kings. It is a fortress for secrets. To understand the room with no door, we must first understand the silence that surrounds it. Can you hear it? The heavy, oppressive silence of the 17th century. A time when a king's word was law, and a king's secret was a burden that could crush a soul. The Escorial is a vast, labyrinthine complex. It is a monastery, a basilica, a royal palace, and a library, all carved from the gray stone of the mountains. It feels eternal, solid, unchangeable. When you run your hand along the rough, cold walls, you are touching the same stone that King Philip touched. You are breathing the same stagnant, incense-heavy air that filled these corridors hundreds of years ago. The construction of this place was an act of devotion, but also an act of fear. The Hapsburg dynasty, the rulers of half the known world, were a family obsessed with legacy and terrified of what flowed in their own veins. They built thick walls not just to keep enemies out, but to keep their own truths in. Let us walk down the hallway of the western wing. The floor is made of polished marble, cool beneath your feet. Your footsteps echo softly, a rhythmic tap, tap, tap that disappears into the vaulted ceiling. To your left, magnificent tapestries hang from the ceiling to the floor, depicting scenes of hunting and war. Their colors have faded, with time crimson turning to rust, royal blue turning to slate gray, but the eyes of the woven figures still seem to watch you as you pass. To your right. There are windows, tall and narrow, looking out over the manicured courtyards below. But tonight, the shutters are drawn. The palace is asleep, or at least it pretends to be. It was here, in this very corridor, that the master masons of the 1600s were given a task that defied all logic. Imagine them, working by the light of oil lamps, their faces smeared with stone dust and sweat. They were the best builders in Europe, men who knew how to construct arches that could hold up the heavens. They were used to building grand doorways, majestic staircases, and soaring domes, but on a cold winter night, under the direct orders of the royal confessor, they were handed a new set of plans. These plans were not drawn by the royal architect. They were sketched on a scrap of unrefined paper, sealed with the king's personal wax signet. The instructions were simple yet chilling. They were to build a chamber, a small intimate room. It was to have a floor of smooth slate. It was to have a small ventilation grate cleverly hidden high in the masonry, connecting to the chimney flue so that smoke would not enter, but air and sound could travel. It was to be furnished with a single bed, a small table, and a chair, and then once the furniture was placed inside ... They were to build the fourth wall. Imagine the confusion of the masons. To build a wall is to create a barrier. To build a wall across the only entrance is to create a tomb. They must have looked at each other in the flickering lamplight, the shadows dancing on their worried faces. They must have asked in hushed whispers, "Who is this for?" But in the Spanish court, questions were dangerous things. Questions could lead to the dungeon. Questions could lead to the fire. So they worked in silence, the sound of their trowels scraping against the stone scrape. Settle, scrape, settle would have been the only sound in the dead of night. Brick by brick, the opening was closed. The view into the small, dark room became narrower and narrower, until finally only a single gap remained, a gap just large enough for a man's hand to pass through. And then, with a final layer of mortar and the placement of the last heavy stone, the gap was gone, the wall was smoothed over. Plaster was applied. A layer of paint, matching the rest of the corridor, was brushed onto the fresh surface. And then a large, heavy tapestry was hung over the spot, concealing the new construction completely. To any passerby, to any servant walking the hall the next morning, nothing had changed. The corridor looked exactly as it always had. The wall looked solid. The palace looked impenetrable. But the physics of the world dictates that matter cannot simply disappear. A space had been created, a pocket of emptiness in a mountain of stone, and inside that pocket the air was still. The darkness was absolute. Why would a king, a man who could own any palace, any land, any treasure, need a room that no one could enter? The answer lies not in what they wanted to keep out, but in what they needed to contain. As the years turned into decades, the masons who built the wall grew old and died. Some say they took their secret to the grave. Others whisper that they met unfortunate accidents shortly after the work was completed: a fall from scaffolding, a sudden fever, a disappearance on the road to Madrid. The Hapsburgs were thorough housekeepers. They knew that a secret shared is a secret halved, but a secret buried with the dead remains whole forever. And so, the room disappeared from the eyes of men, but it did not disappear from the reality of the palace. It became a ghost limb of the Escorial unseen, yet felt life in the palace continued. Kings held court. Ambassadors arrived in carriages adorned with gold leaf, bringing gifts of silk and spices. The laughter of the infantas rang through the gardens. But beneath the surface of this royal splendor, a dark routine began. A routine known only to three people: the king, the royal confessor, and a single, mute servant whose tongue had been removed not as punishment, but as a precaution. Every night at the hour of the Wolf, when the moon was highest and the castle guards were changing shifts, this servant would walk down that marble corridor. He carried no lantern, for he knew the way by touch. He carried a silver tray, covered with a heavy velvet cloth. On the tray was not scraps, but a meal fit for a prince, roasted pheasant, soft bread, and wine diluted with water. He would stop at a specific section of the wall, the section hidden behind the great tapestry of the hunt. With practiced hands, he would slide the heavy fabric aside. There, indistinguishable from the rest of the masonry, was a loose stone. It was not loose by the decay of time, but by the precision of engineering. A hidden lever, a counterweight mechanism buried deep in the wall, allowed the stone to pivot silently on an oiled hinge. A dark cavity would open. A breath of stale, cold air would escape, smelling of damp stone and something else, something muskier. The smell of a life lived in confinement. The servant would place the food onto the ledge inside. He would wait. Sometimes for a minute, sometimes for an hour. He would wait for the tray to be taken, and in the silence of the night he would hear it. A soft shuffling, the sound of bare feet dragging across slate. A hand, pale as moonlight and thin as a spider's leg, would emerge from the darkness to grasp the silver platter. There were never any words spoken. What could be said to a shadow? What language does one speak to a brother who does not exist? Once the tray was taken, the stone would be pushed back into place. The tapestry would be lowered. The corridor would return to its deceptive emptiness. Inside the room, the darkness was almost total. The only light came from the ventilation shaft high above, a narrow slit that allowed a single beam of moonlight to traverse the floor like the hand of a clock. By this faint, celestial light, the occupant of the room learned to see. He was not a monster in the way the fairy tales describe. He had no horns, no scales. He was a boy born with the heavy jaw of the Hapsburgs, yes, but twisted in a way that the court physicians deemed a mark of God's disfavor. His spine was curved like a question mark. His limbs were elongated, but his eyes were sharp. While the world outside played politics, he played with shadows. Confined to a 10-by-10 stone box, his universe was microscopic. He knew every crack in the floor. He knew the texture of the granite. He knew the spiders that spun webs in the corners were his only companions, and he treated them with the reverence of subjects, but he was not cut off from the world. The ventilation shaft, designed to bring in air, also brought in information. It was an acoustic accident, or perhaps a mason's final act of mercy, that the shaft acted as an amplifier. It connected not just to the outside air, but resonated with the chimney flues of the king's private study. Located 2 floors above. During the day, the boy would sit on his small chair, pressing his ear against the cold stone wall. Listening, he heard the king and his brother pacing the floor above. He heard the rustle of maps being unrolled. He heard the heavy sighs of a monarch burdened by war. He heard the whispers of generals discussing troop movements in Flanders. He heard the panic in their voices when the treasury ran low. The boy in the wall had no teachers, no books, no tutors. But he had the secrets of the empire poured directly into his ear. He learned the names of foreign kings. He learned the geography of lands he would never see. He learned the strategy of war better than the generals who fought them, because he had nothing else to distract him. His mind, unburdened by the visuals of the world, became a vault of pure data. As the years passed, the boy became a man shaped by stone. His skin was translucent, veined like marble. His voice unused was a rasp, but his mind was a razor. And then, one night, the dynamic changed. The king, Charles II, was known to history as the Bewitched. He was frail, weak-minded, prone to fits of melancholia. He struggled to rule a crumbling empire. One evening, sitting in his study, weeping over a defeat in battle, the king cried out aloud, What am I to do? God, tell me, what am I to do? And from the fireplace, a voice answered. It was low, distorted by the length of the chimney, echoing like a spirit from the underworld. It did not speak of God, it spoke of logistics. "Move the tertio regiments to the valley," the voice rasped. "The French will not expect the flank." The king froze. He thought he was losing his mind. He thought it was a demon, but he was desperate. He issued the order, and the Spanish forces won. From that night on, the relationship shifted. The king did not know it was his brother. He believed it was a spirit, a guardian angel sent to guide the Hapsburgs. He would spend hours in his study, talking to the fireplace, and the voice in the walls would answer. The Shadow Prince was no longer just a prisoner. He was the secret ruler of Spain, but secrets like stone eventually crack under pressure. The angel in the fireplace guided the king for a decade. But the body of the hidden prince was failing. The dampness of the room, the lack of sunlight, the years of isolation, they took their toll. The coughs from behind the wall became more frequent, wet and heavy. The advice became sporadic. The king, terrified of losing his spectral guide, ordered the mute servant to bring medicines, elixirs, holy water. But how do you heal a man who has never seen the sun? The end came in the winter of 1699, just 1 year before the king himself would die on a night of howling wind. The servant arrived at the hidden wall with the tray. He pressed the mechanism. The stone swung open, but there was no shuffling sound. There was no hand reaching out from the dark. The servant, violating the strictest order, took a candle and leaned into the hole. The light flickered, illuminating the small stone cell. For the first time in 40 years, he saw the chair. He saw the piles of chicken bones, stacked in neat, obsessive pyramids. He saw the walls, covered in scratches, patterns, calculations, maps of Europe drawn with a piece of sharp flint. The mind of a genius carved into his own prison, and on the bed, curled into a fetal position, lay the Shadow Prince. He was still. The Hapsburg Jaw, the mark of his bloodline, was set in a final grimace of pain. The eyes that had never seen a sunset were closed forever. The servant closed the wall. He did not tell the king. He could not. To tell the king would be to admit that the angel was mortal, that the voice was flesh and bone. So, the servant simply stopped bringing the food. The king called out to the fireplace that night. "Spirit, are you there? The French are gathering at the border. Speak to me." But the fireplace was cold. The walls were silent. The king fell into a deep depression, convinced that God had abandoned him. He died shortly after, and with him the Hapsburg dynasty ended. The palace moved on. New kings from a new house, the Bourbons took the throne. They did not know of the secret room. They did not know of the brother in the wall. They hung new tapestries. They renovated the corridors. They plastered over the hidden lever, sealing the mechanism forever. The room became a time capsule. A bubble of the 17th century, floating in the dark. For 300 years, the Shadow Prince lay in state, not in a royal crypt with gold and incense, but in the cold silence of his cell. His body turned to dust. His clothes disintegrated, but the chair remained. The scratches on the wall remained. When the radar beams hit that void in 2018, they didn't just find a room. They found a tragedy frozen in time. The architects who broke through the wall described the air that rushed out as ancient. When they stepped inside, they found the floor covered in a thick layer of gray dust. There were no bones left time, and the damp had claimed them entirely. But on the seat of the small, child-sized chair, there was an indentation. A mark of where someone had sat, day after day, year after year, listening to a world he could never join. And on the wall, Scratched deep into the granite near the ventilation shaft was a single word carved over and over again in jagged, desperate letters. It wasn't a curse. It wasn't a prayer. It was simply hermano, brother, a plea sent through the stone that was never truly heard. The room with no door was not just a prison. It was the heart of the palace, beating in the dark, until it simply ... stopped. But as the architects cataloged the contents of the room, they found something else. Something that shouldn't have been there. Hidden beneath the loose floor stone where the food was once placed, there was a small, leather-bound journal. The pages were brittle, crumbling at the touch. How did a prisoner get paper? How did he get ink? As the historians carefully lifted the fragile cover, they realized that the story of the Hapsburgs was not just about a hidden prince. The first page of the diary contained a list of names. Names of children. Not just one, but many. The Shadow Prince was not the first to be hidden in the walls. And he was not the last. What other secrets are buried in the foundations of Europe's great dynasties? To find the answer, we must travel north, away from the stone of Spain, to the mist-shrouded forests of Bavaria, ... where a castle stands that was built not for a king, but for madness itself. To understand the monster in the wall, we must first look at the monster in the mirror. History remembers the Habsburgs for their crowns, their gold, and an empire upon which the sun never set. But biology remembers them for something else. Something twisted. Something that science calls mandibular prognathism, but which the world simply calls the Hapsburg Jaw. It was not merely a cosmetic flaw. It was a sentence written in bone. If you look closely at the portraits hanging in the Prado Museum today, look past the velvet robes and the shining armor, look at the faces. The lower jaw juts out so far that the bottom teeth sit inches ahead of the top. The tongue, too large for the mouth, lolls lazily against the lip. The nose is hooked, the eyes drooping and watery. These were the faces of the most powerful men in Europe. But beneath the skin, they were suffering. King Charles II, the brother of our hidden prince, could barely speak. He could not chew. His jaw was so deformed that his top and bottom teeth could not meet. He swallowed his food whole like a snake. His stomach was constantly plagued by indigestion, his body racked with vomiting and fevers, but this deformity did not appear overnight. It was not a random accident of nature. It was a project of purity that spanned 200 years. The Habsburgs believed their blood was divine. They believed they were chosen by God to rule the earth, and therefore their blood could not be mixed with the common blood of lesser mortals, and so they did the unthinkable. They closed the circle. Uncles married nieces. First cousins married first cousins. Brothers-in-law married sisters-in-law. For generations, the family tree of the Habsburgs did not branch out like a healthy oak. It grew inward, tangling upon itself like a suffocating vine. This is the story of how a royal family tried to breed a god, but instead created a genetic catastrophe. This is the curse that built the room with no door. Now, let the image of the deformed jaw fade from your mind's eye. Let the clinical harshness of the medical diagnosis dissolve into the mists of time. We are traveling back, further back before the ruin, to a time of glory. Imagine the scent of Austrian pines in the crisp mountain air. The year is 1496. The world is vast and opening up. Ships are sailing to the new world, their white sails catching the wind like the wings of angels. The Renaissance is painting the world in new colors: gold, crimson, and azure. But in the stone courts of Europe, a different kind of map is being drawn. A map not of land, but of marriage. There was a Latin motto that the family lived by, whispered in the corridors of power. Bella Gerentali to Felix Austria Nuba. Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry. While other kings fought bloody battles to conquer land, sacrificing thousands of men in the mud, the Habsburgs simply married into power. They acquired the Netherlands, Spain, the Americas, and parts of Italy, not by the sword, but by the wedding ring. It was a brilliant strategy. It made them the masters of the world without shedding a drop of their own blood, but every strategy has a cost. To keep these vast lands, they had to ensure that no outsider ever inherited them. The titles, the gold, the armies, they had to stay in the family, and so the trap was set. Imagine a drop of ink falling into a glass of clear water. It swirls, it dilutes, it spreads. This is natural. This is how life survives. But the Habsburgs tried to keep the ink contained in a single droplet. They refused to dilute it. And over centuries, that droplet became black, thick, and poisonous. To understand the tragedy of the Shadow Prince, the boy hidden in the wall, we must look at his ancestor. The woman who started the descent. History has given her a cruel name, Joanna the Mad. Can you see her? A young woman, beautiful and intense, standing on the ramparts of a castle in Castile. Her hair is loose, whipping in the wind. Her eyes are wide, fixed on a horizon that no one else can see. Legend says she was driven insane by love. When her husband, Philip the Handsome, died young, Joanna refused to let him go. Quite literally, the archives tell us that she refused to bury him. She kept his coffin open. She traveled across the dusty roads of Spain with the decomposing corpse of her husband in a wagon, opening the lid every night to kiss his cold, dead feet. She was jealous even of death. She forbade any other woman from approaching the corpse, believing that even in death he might be tempted. The court whispered that she was possessed. The church whispered that she was cursed. But modern doctors, looking back at the records, see something else. They see the first cracks in the porcelain. They see the early signs of schizophrenia and melancholia that would plague her. Descendants for centuries. Joanna was locked away in a nunnery for the rest of her life. Her son, Charles V, took the throne. He was the most powerful man since the Roman Caesars. He ruled an empire so vast that when the sun set in Madrid, it was rising in Manila, but Charles V had the jaw. He grew a thick beard to hide it. He ate alone so no one would see him struggle to chew. The seed of decay was already planted, growing silently in the dark soil of their DNA. Let us speak of numbers, but softly. In genetics, there is a term called the inbreeding coefficient. It measures how closely related your parents are. It is a measure of risk, a measure of doom. If two random strangers have a child, the coefficient is 0. The blood is fresh. The possibilities are endless. If two first cousins have a child, the coefficient is roughly 0.06. A small risk, but manageable. If a brother and sister have a child, the coefficient is 0.25. This is dangerous. This is where nature begins to rebel. When scientists recently analyzed the genome of King Charles II and his hidden brother, the Shadow Prince, their coefficient was 0.254. Think about that for a moment in the silence of the night. Their genetics were more compromised than if their parents had been brother and sister. This is because their parents were uncle and niece, but their parents were also cousins, and their parents were also blood relatives. The genetic damage had compounded layer upon layer. Like sediment turning into stone, the result was a biological collapse. In the Spanish court of the 1600s. Childhood was a minefield. The Hapsburg queens gave birth frequently, desperate for an heir. They prayed to every saint. They drank holy water. But the cradles remained empty. Miscarriage, stillbirth, death in the first week. The Palace of El. Escorial was not filled with the sound of children playing. It was filled with the sound of weeping mothers. There is a place in the Escorial, a cold marble crypt known as the Pantheon of the Infants. It is filled with small white coffins, dozens of them, a silent testimony to the blood that could not sustain life and those who survived. They were frail. They bled easily. They were prone to rickets, epilepsy, and dropsy. Their immune systems were so weak that a common cold could be a death sentence. The doctors of the time, the royal physicians, were baffled. They did not understand DNA. They did not understand recessive genes or chromosomes. To them, blood was spiritual. If the king's children were dying, it wasn't because of biology. It was because of witchcraft. This is the crucial turning point. This is why the room in the wall was eventually built. The court began to believe that the Hapsburg line was under a spiritual attack. They believed that enemies of Spain sorcerers from France or heretics from the north had placed a hex on the royal womb. They didn't look at the family tree. They didn't blame the fact that King Philip IV married his own niece. They blame the devil, and when you believe the devil is attacking you, you don't call a doctor. You call an exorcist. The atmosphere in the palace shifted from regal to fanatical. The corridors began to smell less of perfume and more of burning sage and sulfur. Priests were brought in to bless the bedsheets. Relics, bones of saints, splinters of the true cross, vials of tears were placed under the queen's pillow. To ensure a healthy birth. It is in this climate of hysteria that the timeline of our story truly begins. The year is 1661. The Queen, Mariana of Austria, is pregnant. Mariana herself is a Hapsburg. She is the niece of her husband, the king. She is a woman of pale skin and nervous temperament, constantly fingering her rosary beads until her fingertips are raw. She knows the history. She knows that her previous children have died or been born weak. She feels the pressure of the entire empire resting on her swollen belly. She prays for a son, a strong son. A son who can hold a sword and wear the heavy crown of Spain without crumbling under its weight. But the palace whispers. The servants claim that the queen's pregnancy is ... wrong. They say she is too large. They say she craves raw meat. They say that during the full moon, strange sounds come from the royal bedchamber, not cries of pain, but low, guttural growls. Of course, these are likely the exaggerations of superstitious maids, but they paint a picture of the fear that gripped the court. Everyone was waiting. Everyone was terrified of what would emerge. The labor began on a stormy night in November. The wind howled through the Guadarrama mountains, rattling the window panes of the delivery room like unseen hands trying to break in. The king, Philip IV, waited in the antechamber, pacing back and forth. He was an old man now, tired, his face sagging with the weight of his own deformity. He needed an heir. This was his last chance. Inside the room, the midwives worked in hushed panic. The royal confessor stood in the corner, chanting Latin prayers, his voice rising against the sound of the thunder and then ... silence. Usually, when a child is born, there is a cry. A sharp, piercing wail that signals life. But on this night, there was no cry. There was only the gasping of the queen and the rustle of bloody linens. The king burst into the room. "What is it?" he demanded, his voice trembling. "Is it a boy?" The head midwife, her hands trembling, turned to face him. She held a bundle of cloth, but she did not hold it up in triumph. She held it close to her chest, as if trying to hide it. "It is a boy, your majesty," she whispered. "But..." The king stepped forward and pulled back the cloth. The thunder clapped outside, illuminating the room in a flash of white light. And in that brief second, the king saw the face of his son. It was a face that defied the laws of nature. The jaw was not just prominent. It was detached, hanging loosely. The skull was elongated, pulsing with a visible, rapid heartbeat beneath the thin, translucent skin. The eyes were wide, too wide and entirely black, absorbing the light of the candles, but it was not just the face. It was the awareness. Most newborns are confused, crying, blind to the world. But this child was looking at him, staring, calculating. There was an intelligence in those black eyes that felt ancient. It was as if the accumulated knowledge of the entire Hapsburg line, the madness of Joanna, the power of Charles V, the melancholy of Philip had all been distilled into this single, broken vessel. The king recoiled. "This cannot be," he muttered. "This is not my heir. This is a judgment." The priests in the room fell silent. They crossed themselves. They knew the law. A monster could not inherit the throne. A monster was a sign of God's wrath. If the people of Spain saw this child, they would revolt. They would say the Habsburgs had lost the mandate of heaven, but the child was alive, and he was of royal blood. To kill him would be regicide, a mortal sin. The king looked at the queen, who was weeping silently. Then he looked at the confessor. "He was never born," the king said, his voice cold and final. "Do you understand? The queen has not yet given birth. This did not happen. The midwives were sworn to secrecy on pain of death. The child was whisked away, not to a nursery, but to the deep cellars of the palace, and the waiting continued, miraculously. Or perhaps tragically, the queen was carrying twins. 5 days later, the second child was born. This was Charles. Charles the Bewitched. He was weak. He was deformed. He was sickly. But compared to the first child, he was human. He was passable. The bells of Madrid rang out. Bonfires were lit. The people celebrated. "An heir!" they cried. "The dynasty is saved." But deep within the palace, the masons were already at work, while the court celebrated the birth of Charles. The first one, the Shadow Prince, was being moved. They needed a place to keep him. A place that was not a dungeon, for he was a prince, but a place that was not a room, for he did not exist. They chose the space behind the western wall. They reinforced the stone. They created the ventilation shaft that would link him to the king's study, perhaps unconsciously knowing that this child, this rejected monster, held the true intellect of the family. As the years passed, the curse of the blood became evident in both brothers. Charles, the visible king, grew up in the light, but the light was cruel to him. He could not walk until he was 8 years old. He could not speak until he was 10. He was treated like a porcelain doll, protected, coddled, and pitied. His education was neglected because the doctors feared that thinking too hard would strain his weak brain. But in the darkness of the wall, the other brother grew differently, stripped of distractions, stripped of the comforts that make men soft. The Shadow Prince became a creature of pure mind. His deformity, which made physical movement painful, forced him to live inside his own head. He didn't have tutors, but he had the chimney. He listened. Imagine the irony. The King of Spain, sitting in his velvet chair, struggling to read a simple letter, his mind clouded by genetic fog. And 10 feet away, separated by a wall of granite, his brother sat in the dark, memorizing the tax codes of Castile, the naval routes to the Indies, and the complex treaties with France. One brother had the crown. The other brother had the brain. It was a duality. That could not last. The blood that bound them was the same blood that was killing them. As they reached adulthood, the Hapsburg curse entered its final, most distinctive phase, the melancholy. It is said that the Habsburgs did not just die. They faded. They lost the will to live. Charles II spent his days wandering the gardens, staring at the statues, convinced that he was made of glass and would shatter if he moved too fast. But what of the Shadow Prince? Did he have melancholy? The few scraps of evidence, the scratches on the wall, the patterns of the chicken bones, suggest something else. They suggest rage. Think of the isolation. To know you are royalty, to feel the power in your blood, but to be fed like a dog in the dark. To hear the servants whisper about the idiot king while you, the genius, sit naked on cold stone. This rage must have burned hot enough to warm the stone walls. But perhaps, in the silence of the night, there was also a strange connection. The records from the royal physicians mention that King Charles often complained of phantom pains. He would feel a sharp ache in his side or a throbbing in his head for no apparent reason. Was it possible that the twins were connected? That when the Shadow Prince shivered in the cold, the king shivered in his warm bed? That when the prince felt the pang of hunger, the king lost his appetite? Science calls this sympathetic connection. The Hapsburgs would have called it the bond of blood. There is a story, recorded in a letter by the French ambassador, of a strange event in 1680. A grand banquet was being held. The king was seated at the head of the table. Suddenly he dropped his goblet. His eyes rolled back. He began to scream, clutching his throat, gasping for air as if he were being strangled. The doctors rushed to him. They found no obstruction. They found no poison, but at that exact moment, in the hidden room, the mute servant had accidentally dropped the heavy stone lid of the food hatch onto the Shadow Prince's hand. Crushing his fingers, the king felt the pain of the brother he didn't know existed. This incident terrified the court. They whispered that the king was possessed by a demon who tortured him from the inside. They didn't realize the torture was coming from the outside. From the other side of the wall, this connection brings us to the ultimate tragedy of the Hapsburg blood. They tried to keep their power by keeping their blood to themselves. They wanted to be a closed loop. And they succeeded. They became so connected, so intertwined, that they could feel each other's pain across walls, across silence. They were not a family anymore. They were a single, suffering organism fighting against itself. As we lie here tonight, safe in the darkness of our own rooms, we can take comfort in the distance. We are not bound by such heavy chains. Our blood is our own. Our thoughts are our own, but for the Habsburgs, there was no privacy. There was no self. There was only the family. The line, the curse. The Shadow Prince was the ultimate victim of this philosophy. He was the spare that was never meant to be used. But who ended up carrying the weight of the dynasty's intelligence? While his brother carried the weight of the crown, two halves of a whole, separated by 3 feet of granite. In the end, biology won. It always does. The Hapsburg line did not end with a bang, but with a whimper. King Charles II died at the age of 38. His autopsy stated that his heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs corroded, his intestines gangrenous, his head full of water. He was a man whose body simply gave up. But what of the Shadow Prince? When the king died, the heartbeat of the palace slowed. The chaos of succession began. The War of the Spanish Succession tore Europe apart. In the confusion, the mute servant ... disappeared. Perhaps he died of the plague. Perhaps he fled. The food stopped coming. We can only imagine the final days in the room with no door. The waiting. The slow realization that the silence was not temporary. The hunger. And finally, the cold. Did he scream? Or did he accept his fate with the stoic dignity of a king? When the radar found the room in 2018, there were no bones. Just dust. And the scratches, some historians believe that the Shadow Prince is just a legend, a metaphor for the hidden sickness of the family. But those who have stood in that corridor late at night tell a different story. They say that if you press your ear against the western wall, near the old tapestry, you don't hear the wind. You don't hear the settling of the stone. You hear a low, rhythmic humming, like a child trying to soothe himself. To sleep. Humm. Humm. It is the sound of a lullaby that was never sung. A song for the boys who were broken by their own blood. So, as you drift off tonight, let the walls of your own room protect you. Let the space around you be open and free. You are not walled in. You are not hidden. You are safe. The Hapsburgs built walls to keep their secrets. But the truth is, secrets have a way of seeping through the stone, like water, like time, like dreams. Rest now. The history is written. The book is closed. The candle is blown out. There are no more whispers in the wall. Only silence. Sleep. November 6th, 1661, the night the Habsburg Empire cracked. History books will tell you this was the night King Charles II was born, the savior of Spain, the miracle heir. But the history books are lying. They only tell you about the second child. They do not speak of the first. On this specific night, a storm of biblical proportions descended upon the Guadarrama Mountains. The sky turned a bruised purple, and thunder shook the granite foundations of El Escorial so violently that the candles in the royal chapel were extinguished by the vibrations alone. It was as if the heavens themselves were screaming in protest at what was happening in the Queen's bedchamber inside that room. Smelling of blood and burning sage, a secret was born before it could be buried. The midwives did not cheer. The king did not smile. When the first child emerged, wet and silent, the royal confessor recoiled, clutching his crucifix until his knuckles turned white. He saw the elongated skull. He saw the black, knowing eyes. He saw a creature that looked less like a human infant and more like a punishment from God. The king made a choice in that split second, a choice that would haunt the palace for centuries. He looked at the midwife and whispered a command that was colder than the storm outside. Hide it. Build the wall. This child never happened. This is the truth the king buried. Now let the thunder fade into the distance. Let the panic of that moment dissolve into the river of time. We are safe here, drifting back through the centuries, carried by the current of memory. The storm is no longer a threat. It is merely a sound, a rhythmic drumming of rain against heavy stone, lulling the world to sleep. Imagine you are standing outside the great palace of El Escorial on that fateful night. The air is cold, biting, carrying the scent of wet pine and ozone. The massive gray walls of the palace rise up into the darkness, solid and immovable. Like a mountain carved by human hands. To understand the birth, we must understand the fear. For 9 months, the palace had been holding its breath. Queen Mariana, a woman of fragile health and immense burden, had carried the future of the dynasty within her. But it was a heavy burden. The court physicians had watched her with growing unease. Her belly had grown to a size that defied logic. Her skin had stretched so thin it appeared translucent, revealing the blue veins beneath like a map of rivers. She spoke of dreams. Vivid, terrifying dreams where she was wandering through the endless corridors of the palace, followed by a shadow that had no owner. She would wake up screaming, drenched in cold sweat, clutching her rosary beads so tightly they left marks on her palms. The king, Philip IV, was an old man by this time. His face, captured in so many paintings, was a mask of weary sorrow. He had buried so many children. He had buried 2 wives. He had seen his empire crumble at the edges. All he wanted, all he prayed for, was one healthy son to carry his name. But the Habsburg blood was tired. It was exhausted by generations of circling back upon itself. It was like a piece of paper folded too many times. The fibers were breaking. As the sun set on November 6th, the clouds gathered. They came from the north, rolling over the peaks like a dark tide. The wind began to howl, whistling through the stone gargoyles that guarded the roofline, making them sound as if they were coming to life. Inside the queen's chamber, the atmosphere was thick with incense. The windows were shuttered and draped with heavy velvet to keep out the drafts, but nothing could keep out the sound of the storm. Boom. The thunder rolled. Boom. The contraction came. The room was crowded. In the 17th century, a royal birth was not a private medical event. It was a state ceremony. Witnesses were required. The prime minister, the nobles, the high-ranking clergy, they all waited in the antechamber, listening, judging. But inside the inner sanctum, closest to the queen, were only the most trusted. The head midwife, a woman named Ines, who had delivered 3 generations of royalty. The royal physician, Dr. Giletti, who believed more in astrology than anatomy, and the confessor, Father Nithord, a man whose shadow was often longer than the king's. They went about their work in hushed tones. Basins of hot water, clean linens, relics of St. Isidore placed on the queen's abdomen. They were doing everything right by the standards of their time. But nature does not care for rituals. Nature cares only for biology. As the hours stretched on, the storm intensified. Rain lashed against the shutters like handfuls of gravel. The wind shrieked down the chimneys, sending puffs of ash into the room. It felt ominous. It felt as though the elements were trying to break in, to witness the arrival of something forbidden. Queen Mariana was exhausted. Her strength was failing. The physician checked her pulse and shook his head. "The moon is in a bad house," he murmured to the priest. "Saturn is obstructing." But it wasn't Saturn. It was the genes. Let us slow down even further. Let us freeze time in that candlelit room. Look at the shadows dancing on the walls. The flickering flames cast long, distorted shapes that seem to writhe and twist. The smell is overpowering, a mixture of beeswax. Lavender oil used to calm the queen, and the metallic tongue of fear. The queen cries out. It is time. The midwife leans in. Her hands are steady, but her eyes are wide. She feels something. Wrong. The position of the child is strange. The head is too large. Push, Your Majesty, she whispers. For Spain, push, and then the moment arrives. The moment that splits the timeline in two. The first child enters the world. There is no cry. No wail of life. Only the sound of the rain drumming on the roof. The midwife holds the infant in her hands. She is a professional. She has seen deformities before. She has seen hair lips, clubbed feet, missing fingers. But this is different. The child is long. Unnaturally long. His limbs hang loosely as if the joints are made of water. His skin is pale, almost gray, and covered in a fine, dark hair. But it is the face that stops her heart. The jaw, the famous Hapsburg jaw, is exaggerated to the point of caricature. It is dislocated, hanging open, but the eyes are open. Usually a newborn's eyes are unfocused, cloudy blue or gray. This child's eyes are black, sharp, aware. He does not cry because he is watching. He is observing the room with a terrifying, silent intelligence. The midwife gasps. She instinctively pulls the cloth over the child's face, as if to shield the world from him, or him from the world. The king steps forward. He is trembling. Give him to me, he commands. He takes the bundle. He lifts the cloth. For a moment, the king and the monster stare at each other. Father and son. Creator and creation. In that silence, Philip IV sees the culmination of his family's sins. He sees the arrogance of his ancestors who thought they could defy nature. He sees the end of his line. He does not feel love. He feels horror. Is he breathing? The king asks. Yes, sire, the midwife replies, her voice barely audible. He is strong. His heart? It beats slowly but powerfully. The confessor steps forward, holding a silver basin of holy water. We must baptize him, he says urgently. If he dies unbaptized, his soul ... No, the king interrupts. The room freezes. To deny baptism is to deny heaven. This is not my heir, the king says, his voice flat and dead. This is a test, a trial sent by God to punish my pride. He looks at the midwife. You will take him away, down to the lower cellars. He is to be fed. He is to be kept alive. But he is never to be seen. He is never to be named. But sire, the midwife stammers, what do I tell the court? They are waiting for a prince. The king looks at the queen. She is still in pain. Her labor is not over. Wait, the physician says, his hands on the queen's stomach. There is another. The storm outside gives a final, earth-shaking roar of thunder. And in the wake of that sound, the second child begins to descend. The mood in the room shifts from horror to frantic hope. Could it be? Could God have granted a mercy? 10 minutes later, Charles is born. He is small. He is frail. His head is covered in a crust of cradle cap. He is weak, but he cries. It is a thin, mewling sound like a wounded kitten, but it is a human sound. He has the jaw, yes, but it is within the realm of what they recognize. He is broken, but he is not a monster. The king weeps. Tears of relief stream down his old, tired face. He kisses the forehead of the second child. Charles, he whispers. You are Charles. And while the king holds the second son, the savior, up to the candlelight ... The first son, the shadow, is quietly wrapped in a rough wool blanket. The midwife, tears streaming down her own face, slips out of the side door. She carries the silent bundle down the servants' stairs. Down past the kitchens where the feast is being prepared. Down past the wine cellars. Down into the cold, damp dark of the stone foundations. The shadow prince does not cry out as he is carried away from the warmth, away from the light, away from his mother. He simply watches the shadows passing by, his black eyes recording every turn, every step, every betrayal. He is 10 minutes old, and he has already been erased from history. Can you imagine the loneliness of that first night? Upstairs, the palace exploded into celebration. The trumpets sounded from the balconies. The heralds rode out into the rain to announce to the people of Madrid that a healthy prince had been born. The wine flowed. The nobles toasted the health of King Charles II, but downstairs, deep in the earth, there was no celebration. There was only a wicker basket placed on a stone floor. There was only the sound of water dripping from the ceiling. Drip, 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 a clock counting down the seconds of a life that was now secret. The storm outside began to break. The thunder rolled away to the east, leaving behind a silence that was heavy and absolute. The midwife, Inés, stayed with him that first night. She could not leave him alone in the dark. She sat on a wooden stool, rocking the basket. She hummed a lullaby, a simple folk song from the countryside, trying to bring a moment of warmth to the cold stone room. She noticed something strange as the night wore on. The child did not sleep. Most newborns sleep for 16 hours. This child lay awake, his eyes fixed on the flickering candle flame. He was calm, unnaturally calm. It was as if he was waiting, as if he knew that his time had not yet come. Upstairs, the real Prince Charles was already being swaddled in silk and laid in a cradle of gold. He was surrounded by nurses, guards, and courtiers. Every whimper he made was attended to. Every cough caused panic. But the strong son, the intelligent son, the son who did not cry, he lay in wool and straw. This duality would define the rest of their lives. One in the light, one in the dark. One weak but worshipped, one strong but feared. The storm that shrouded their birth was not just a weather event. It was a metaphor, a violent tearing of the sky to mark the violent tearing of a family. As dawn approached, the first gray light of morning filtered through the high, barred windows of the palace. The storm was over. The puddles in the courtyard reflected the pale sky. The world looked washed clean. But inside the walls, the stain remained. The king issued a decree that morning. The midwife Inez was to be given a pension and sent to a convent in the north, never to speak to anyone again. The royal confessor was given the task of overseeing the special project. The construction of the hidden room we explored earlier, the conspiracy had begun. The lies were being stacked, brick by brick, but secrets are living things. You can bury them, you can wall them up, but they continue to grow. They feed on silence. They breathe in the dark. The Shadow Prince was not just a rejected child. He was the karma of the Hapsburgs made flesh. He was the bill coming due, and as he lay there in the cellar, listening to the muffled cheers of the celebration above, perhaps he understood, even then, that the walls would not hold him forever. The storm had passed. But the work was just beginning. To keep a secret of this magnitude, the king needed more than just a midwife's silence. He needed a cage that looked like a wall, a cage that could hold a mind as sharp as a diamond. He needed a mason, a master builder who could construct a puzzle in stone. But where do you find a man willing to build a prison for a prince? And what happens to that man when the final stone is placed? The king's eyes turned to a man named Mateo, a master craftsman from Toledo. Mateo was summoned to the palace the next day. He was told to bring his tools. He was told he would be paid in gold, but he was not told that the price of the job would be his tongue. The blueprint was drawn. The mortar was mixed. And the next chapter of the tragedy was about to be written in blood and stone. There are two ways to keep a secret. The first is to kill everyone who knows it. The second is to make sure they can never speak it. The King of Spain chose the second. In the winter of 1661. A master mason named Mateo was hired for a job that did not exist. He was the finest builder in Toledo, a man who could stack stones so perfectly that not even a sheet of paper could slide between the blocks. He was brought to the palace at midnight. He was taken to a corridor that was cleared of all guards. He was given a pile of granite, a bucket of mortar, and a single, terrifying instruction: build a room that disappears. Mateo thought he was building a treasury. He thought he was building a safe for the crown jewels. But as the walls went up, he realized there was no door. He realized the ventilation shaft was connected to the king's private chimney. He realized he wasn't building a vault for gold. He was building a coffin for a living thing. When the final stone was placed, Mateo turned to the royal confessor to ask for his payment. He expected a bag of doubloons. Instead, he was seized by 2 guards. He wasn't killed. No, death is too loud. Instead, the royal surgeon stepped forward with a heated blade. Mateo was told that his hands were too valuable to lose, but his tongue was a liability. He left the palace that night with his pockets full of gold and his mouth full of blood. He lived for 20 more years, the only man who knew where the monster was hidden, but he could never scream the truth. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The horror of the knife fades into the sepia tones of history. The blood washes away, leaving only the clean, gray lines of the stone. We are drifting back to the weeks following the storm. The palace of El Escorial is quiet. The celebrations for the official prince are over. The court has settled into its winter rhythm. The snow lies heavy on the mountains, muffling the world outside. Inside, the fires are lit, casting long, dancing shadows against the tapestries. Close your eyes and imagine the smell of wet mortar, the scent of dust, the sharp, metallic tang of iron tools. We are in the world of Mateo of Toledo. Mateo is not a prince. He is not a priest. He is a man of the earth. His hands are rough, the skin thickened by years of gripping the chisel and the mallet. He smells of limestone and sweat. He is a simple man who understands the honesty of stone. Stone does not lie. Stone does not scheme. If you cut it true, it stands. If you cut it false, it falls. He was summoned to the Escorial on a Tuesday. The letter was vague. It bore the seal of the king, but it was delivered by a monk in a plain brown robe. The palace requires your discretion, the monk had said, and your skill. Mateo packed his tools, his heavy iron hammer, his chisels of varying widths wrapped in oiled leather to keep them from rusting, his plumb line, the weight made of lead. These were extensions of his body. He rode his mule up the winding mountain pass, the wind biting at his face. He looked up at the Escorial as he approached. It was a fortress of God, a grid of windows and towers. He felt a swell of pride. To work on the king's home was the honor of a lifetime. He imagined he would be repairing a cathedral arch, or perhaps carving a new statue for the gardens. He did not know he was riding into a trap. When he arrived, he was not taken to the workmen's quarters. He was not given a barracks. He was ushered through a side gate, the one used for bringing in firewood and carcasses. He was taken deep into the bowels of the palace, to a small, windowless room near the kitchens. "Wait here," the guard said. He waited for 3 days. This is how the psychological conditioning began: isolation, silence, waiting in the dark. Mateo paced the small room. He sharpened his tools. He listened to the muffled sounds of the palace above him, the footsteps, the distant laughter, the ringing of bells. He began to feel small. He began to feel like a stone himself, waiting to be placed. On the third night, the door opened. It was Father Nithard, the royal confessor. The priest was tall, gaunt, his eyes burning with a fanatic intensity. "You are a man of God, Mateo?" The priest asked. "I am, Father," Mateo replied, his voice raspy from disuse. "And you are loyal to the crown?" "I am." "Then come." "The king has a task that requires both your skill and your silence. What you see tonight, you must forget. What you build tonight must never exist." They walked through the silent corridors. The palace was asleep. The only light came from the priest's lantern, casting a swaying circle of yellow light on the marble floor. They walked past the grand staircases, past the library with its thousands of books. Past the royal apartments, they arrived at the western wing. A tapestry had been pulled down, revealing a bare section of wall. "Here," the priest said, pointing to the spot. "We need a chamber. 10 feet by 10 feet. It must be seamless. It must be invisible." Mateo looked at the wall. "A safe room, Father? For the king?" The priest did not answer. He simply handed Mateo a parchment. It was a diagram. Mateo studied in the dim light. His brow furrowed. As a builder, he understood spaces. He understood flow. But this diagram made no sense. It was a box. A perfect box. There was a bed marked in the corner. A chair, a table. "Where is the door?" Mateo asked. "There is no door," the priest replied. "But how will the occupant enter?" "The occupant is already inside," the priest lied. Or perhaps it was a half-truth. "The occupant will be placed inside before you finish the wall." Mateo felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. He looked at the thick granite blocks that had been piled nearby. He looked at the mortar that had already been mixed by silent servants. "Start," the priest commanded. "You have until dawn." And so the work began. Clink, scrape, thud, the sound of the trowel. The sound of the stone settling. Mateo worked. He was a master, and his body took over. He selected a block. He checked its grain. He applied the mortar, a thick gray paste that smelled of wet earth. He placed the stone. He tapped it with the handle of his trowel to set it. Tap, 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 tap. The wall began to rise. First one course of stones. Then two, then three. As he worked, Mateo's mind raced. He was building a tomb. He knew it, but who was it for? A prisoner of state? A heretic? A criminal too dangerous to kill? He paused to wipe the sweat from his brow. He looked through the opening he was closing. The space inside was dark. He couldn't see much, but he could hear. From the shadows of the alcove he heard a sound. Not a plea for help, not a weep. He heard a breath. A small, rhythmic breath, and and it was the breathing of a child. Mateo's hand froze. He dropped his trowel. It clattered loudly on the floor. The priest, who had been sitting in a chair reading a Bible, looked up sharply. "Is there a problem, Mason?" Mateo looked at the priest, then back at the dark hole in the wall. "Father," he whispered, "there is a child inside." The priest stood up. He walked over to Mateo. He placed a hand on the Mason's shoulder. The hand was cold. "There is no child, Mateo," the priest said softly. "There is only the will of God and the will of the king. Do you wish to question the king?" Mateo looked at the darkness again. He imagined a pair of eyes watching him, eyes that knew he was the one sealing the tomb. He felt a wave of nausea. He wanted to run. He wanted to grab his hammer and smash the wall down, but he was a man of the 17th century. The king was God's representative on earth. To disobey the king was to disobey the Creator, and Mateo was a man with a family, a wife in Toledo, 2 daughters. If he ran, they would die. So he picked up his trowel. His hand trembled just slightly. "Forgive me," he whispered to the darkness. He continued to work, but the rhythm had changed. It was no longer the proud rhythm of a craftsman. It was the heavy, mournful rhythm of an executioner. Clink, scrape, thud, the wall rose higher. Waist high, chest high, shoulder high, the opening narrowed. The darkness inside became deeper. The breathing continued, steady and calm. It was unnerving. Why didn't the child cry? Why didn't it beg? It was as if the presence inside accepted the stone. It was as if the stone was where it belonged. Mateo reached the final row. He had to stand on a small wooden stool to reach the top. There was only one gap left. A rectangular hole, just big enough for the last block. He picked up the final stone. It was heavy, granite from the local quarry. He buttered the edges with the gray mortar. He looked through the hole one last time, and in that final second, a beam of moonlight from the ventilation shaft hit the floor of the cell. Mateo saw it. He saw the small, bundled shape on the bed. He saw the face, the jaw, the eyes. The monster looked at the mason. Mateo gasped. He almost dropped the stone. It wasn't a child. It was a tragedy. It was a secret so heavy it could crush the kingdom. The priest cleared his throat. "Finish it." Mateo closed his eyes. He whispered a silent prayer. "May God have mercy on us both." He pushed the final stone into place. Thud. The wall was solid. The breathing was gone. The eyes were gone. There was only the rough, gray surface of the granite. Mateo stood there for a moment, his hand resting on the cold stone. He could feel the vibration of the palace, the hum of the structure. He had become part of the lie. The job was done. The priest nodded approvingly. "You have done well, Mateo," he said. "The crown is pleased. Your craftsmanship is eternal." Mateo climbed down from the stool. He began to pack his tools. His hands were shaking violently now. He wiped the mortar from his trowel, cleaning it obsessively. He wanted to wash the guilt away. "I am finished, Father," Mateo said, keeping his eyes on his boots. "May I go?" "Of course," the priest said. "But first, your payment." Mateo didn't want the money. He just wanted to leave. He wanted to ride his mule back to Toledo and forget he ever saw the Escorial. He wanted to drink wine until the memory of those black eyes faded. "Follow me," the priest said. They walked to a different room. This one was bright. It smelled of vinegar and spirits. It was the surgery. Two guards stood by the door. A man in a leather apron, the royal surgeon, stood by a table. On the table, there were no bags of gold. There was a brazier with coals glowing red hot. And resting in the coals were several thin iron instruments. Mateo stopped. He gripped his hammer. "What is this?" The priest turned to him. His face was sad, almost compassionate. "You know a secret, Mateo? A secret that could destroy the monarchy. We cannot let you carry that burden." "I swear," Mateo pleaded, backing away. "I swear on the Virgin. I will never speak. I will cut out my own tongue before I speak." The priest nodded. "We know you would try, but wine loosens tongues. Nightmares loosen tongues. We cannot take the risk. It is a mercy, Mateo. We are removing the temptation to sin." The guard stepped forward. Mateo was strong, he was a mason, but they were soldiers. They grabbed his arms. He struggled. He tried to raise his hammer, but a blow to his stomach doubled him over. They dragged him to the chair. They strapped his wrists. They strapped his head. The surgeon turned. He held a pair of forceps and a small, curved blade. It glowed dull red in the candlelight. "Open," the surgeon said softly. Mateo clamped his mouth shut. He shook his head. Tears streamed down his dusty cheeks. He thought of his wife. He thought of the songs he used to sing to his daughters. He thought of the simple pleasure of tasting bread. The guard pinched his nose. Mateo held his breath as long as he could, but the body needs air. He gasped, and in that moment the iron entered. There was no scream. There couldn't be. There was only a choked, guttural sound and the smell of singing flesh. It was done quickly. The Hapsburg surgeons were experts. They cauterized the wound instantly to prevent bleeding out. Mateo slumped in the chair. The world spun. The pain was a white-hot sun in the center of his head. The priest placed a heavy bag on the table next to him. The clink of gold coins sounded obscenely loud in the quiet room. "For your trouble," the priest said, "and for your silence. You are free to go?" Mateo stumbled out into the night. He left his tools behind. He didn't want them. He never wanted to build again. He rode his mule down the mountain in the snow. The blood in his mouth tasted of copper and ash. He looked back at the palace one last time. It looked different now. It wasn't a fortress of God, it was a skull. And he had just filled one of the eye sockets with stone. Mateo returned to Toledo. He lived for another 20 years. He became a recluse. He communicated with hand signs and scribbles on slate. His neighbors thought he had been cursed by a witch. They avoided him, but Mateo wasn't cursed by a witch. He was cursed by a king. He spent his days sitting in the cathedral staring at the walls. He knew that walls were not solid. He knew that every wall hides a space. And he knew that in the silence of the stone there is always something listening. Matteo kept his vow. He never wrote down the secret. He never signaled it. He took the location of the room to his grave, but while Matteo's silence was absolute, the silence in the palace was not, because inside the room with no door, the child was growing. The darkness did not kill him. It changed him. And as the mason's life faded into obscurity, the Shadow Prince's life was just beginning to take shape. He was alone. He was in the dark. But he was not asleep. The boy began to explore his prison. He began to touch the walls that Matteo had built. And soon he would find the one thing Matteo had left behind. A single, loose connection to the world above. We are taught that humans are creatures of the light. We need the sun to produce vitamins, to regulate our sleep, to keep our minds tethered to reality. Science tells us that if you lock a human in total darkness for 3 days, the hallucinations begin. If you lock them away for a week, the mind begins to fracture. But what if you are born in the dark? What if darkness is not a punishment, but a mother? The boy inside the walls of the Escorial palace did not know what the sun looked like. He did not know the color blue or the concept of a horizon. For the first 10 years of his life, his universe was exactly 10 feet by 10 feet. A box of cold granite. He was the most secret prisoner in history, yet he committed no crime other than being born, but he did not go mad. That is the true horror of this story. A normal child would have withered and died of fear, but the Shadow Prince ... adapted, like a deep-sea creature evolving to survive the crushing pressure of the ocean floor. He evolved to survive the silence. He didn't just live in the dark, he became the dark. And while his brother, the king, was playing with golden toys in the sunlight, the boy in the wall was sharpening his mind into a weapon that even the stone couldn't contain. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us step out of the blinding light of the modern world. Let your eyes adjust. The frantic pace of the day is left behind, replaced by a stillness that is deep and ancient. Imagine you are descending a long, spiral staircase. Down, down, down. The air gets cooler with every step. The noise of the city fades into a distant memory. You are entering the foundations of the earth, where the only clock is the beating of your own heart. We return to the year 1665. The wall is sealed. The mason is gone. The palace above continues its royal pageant. But here, in the hidden pocket of space, a different kind of life is beginning. Let us sit quietly in the corner of the room with no door. It is pitch black, the kind of blackness that has weight. It presses against your skin like heavy velvet. The boy is 4 years old now. He sits in the center of the room, on the slate floor. He is not crying. He stopped crying years ago. He learned very quickly that crying brings no comfort. It only echoes off the hard stone, a sharp, assaulting sound that hurts his sensitive ears. So he learned silence. To us, this room would be a nightmare. To him, it is the world. It is the only reality he has ever known. He has mapped every inch of it, not with his eyes, but with his fingertips. Imagine his small, pale hand reaching out. He knows the texture of every single block of granite. He knows that the third stone from the left corner has a small chip in it, shaped like a crescent moon, though he does not know what a moon is. He knows that the floor near the ventilation shaft is slightly rougher, worn down by the drops of condensation that fall during the winter. He has named the corners. The warm corner near the chimney flue where the heat seeps through. The wet corner where the damp collects. The eating corner by the stone hatch. And the sleeping corner where his straw mattress lies, he does not have language in the way we do. He has never heard a conversation. He has never been read a bedtime story. But he has thoughts. Complex, geometric thoughts. His mind, unburdened by the distractions of color and movement, has turned inward. He thinks in patterns. He thinks in vibrations. When a guard walks down the corridor outside, separated by 2 feet of solid masonry, the boy feels it. Thump, thump, thump. He can tell the difference between the heavy, booted stride of a soldier and the shuffling, soft-soled walk of a priest. He knows the rhythm of the palace better than the king does. He knows when the shifts change. He knows when the heavy iron gates of the outer courtyard are opened, sending a deep, subterranean shudder through the foundations. He is a seismograph made of flesh and bone. Let us observe his routine. It is a ritual of survival. Twice a day, the mechanism in the wall grinds open. Grr clack, a slab of stone recedes. A ray of dim light, artificial lamplight from the corridor slices into his world. It is blindingly bright to him, painful. He shields his eyes. A tray is pushed through. He does not rush to it. He waits. He waits for the stone to slide back, for the darkness to return. Only then does he approach. The food is rich leftovers from the royal kitchens. Pheasant, soft white bread, spiced wine watered down. The taste is the only explosion of color in his life. He eats slowly, savoring every texture. The crunch of a cartilage, the softness of a crumb. He creates a library of tastes in his mind. He does not know who brings the food. He assumes it is part of the room itself. The room gives and the room takes, but he is not alone. Not entirely. In the dark, even the smallest life forms become giants. He has a companion, a spider. A large, dark Wolf spider that has spun a web in the upper corner of the ventilation shaft. The boy calls the spider Click, because of the tiny, almost inaudible sound its legs make when it scurries across the dry stone. He spends hours sitting perfectly still, listening to Click weave his web. He understands the spider. He understands that the spider waits. The spider is patient. The spider builds a trap and trusts that the world will provide. The boy decides he is like the spider. He's waiting. As the years pass 5, 6, 7, his body begins to change. Adaptation is a powerful force. His skin, never touched by the sun, becomes translucent. You can see the intricate map of blue and purple veins pulsing beneath the surface. He looks like a statue carved from alabaster. His bones are thin, but his fingers are long and incredibly dexterous. He can feel the temperature change in the air when a cloud passes over the sun outside, simply by the shift in the draft coming from the vent. But the most profound change is in his eyes, the pupils of the shadow. Prints have dilated permanently. They are massive, swallowing the iris. Black pools that are desperate for any photon of light. He can see in what we would call total darkness. He can see the dust motes dancing in the faint draft. He can see the thermal outline of the heat rising from his own body. He can see the shimmer of the spider's silk. He sees a world of gray scales, a monochrome kingdom, but because he cannot run or jump or play, his energy goes elsewhere. It goes to his brain. The brain is a hungry organ. It consumes 20% of the body's energy. In the shadow prints, it consumes nearly all of it. Without social cues to process, without landscapes to analyze, his brain begins to process memory and logic with terrifying efficiency. He remembers everything. He remembers the taste of the meal he had 400 days ago. He remembers the exact number of footsteps the guard took last Tuesday. He counts. He categorizes. He begins to scratch marks on the wall with a sharp piece of flint he found. In the mortar. Sc rich. Scritch. He is inventing his own mathematics. He is calculating the intervals of the food hatch. He discovers that the food comes every 43,200 heartbeats. He has discovered the concept of day and night without ever seeing the sky. He is a scientist in a laboratory of one, but a mind this sharp needs more than just numbers. It needs connection. It needs a voice, and this is where the tragedy deepens. Because he knows there are others, he can hear them sometimes. Late at night, when the palace is drunk and loud, the sounds drift down through the stone, laughter, shouting, music. He presses his ear against the cold granite. He listens to the music of the lute and the harpsichord. It is beautiful and it hurts. It is a language he cannot speak, a joy he cannot share. He tries to mimic the sounds. He opens his mouth, his jaw clicking painfully. H. His voice is a croak, a rusted hinge. He has never used it. The sound frightens him. He stops. He realizes that he is different from the voices above. They are fluid. He is solid. They are loud. He is silent. He begins to hate them. And he begins to love them. He imagines what they look like. In his mind, the people above are made of light. They are beings of pure fire who float through the air. He does not know they are flesh and blood like him. He thinks they are gods, and he is the monster in the pit. One winter evening, when the boy is 8 years old, the routine breaks. It is cold. The stone floor is like ice. He is huddled in the warm corner, wrapped in his thin wool blanket, shivering. His breath comes out in white plumes that he can see in the dark. He is pressing himself against the chimney flue, trying to steal a little warmth from the king's fire 2 floors above. Usually the chimney is just a source of heat. But tonight, the wind outside is blowing from a specific direction. It creates a downdraft, a vacuum effect. The ventilation shaft, which connects to the chimney system, acts like an ear trumpet. Suddenly the boy hears a sound. Not a muffled thump, but a voice, clear, distinct, as if the person were standing right next to him. The French are demanding the border territories. The boy freezes. His heart hammers against his ribs. Tell them we have no gold. The treasury is empty. It is a man's voice, weary, sad. It is the voice of Philip IV, the king, his father. The boy does not know the word father. He does not know the word king, but he recognizes the tone. It is the tone of a structure under stress. He listens. He holds his breath until his lungs burn. What am I to do, Father Nethard? God has abandoned us. The boy presses his face into the rough opening of the vent. He closes his eyes. The words flow into him. Border, gold, treasury, God. He does not know what these words mean, but he memorizes them. He stores them in his vault. Night after night, he returns to the spot. He learns the language of the court. He learns that France is an enemy. He learns that gold is something everyone wants. He learns that the man with the sad voice is in charge, but he is weak. The boy in the dark begins to understand the world above. He builds a map of Europe in his mind, not with shapes, but with relationships. France pushes Spain. Spain pushes Flanders. England waits. It is a system of forces, like the tension in a stone arch. And he realizes something profound. The man above the voice is asking questions. He is confused. He doesn't know what to do. The boy in the dark knows what to do. It is simple logic. If A pushes B, then B must reinforce C. He wants to tell the voice. He wants to help. But he has no tongue, no authority, no door. This is the birth of the Shadow Prince. The moment he stops being a prisoner and starts being a participant, he begins to whisper back. At first, It is just a soft, raspy exhaling into the vent. He doesn't know if the sound carries. He doesn't know if the physics of the chimney work both ways. But one night, the king pauses. The boy hears the silence from above. He hears the rustle of velvet as the king stands up. "Who is there?" the king asks, his voice trembling. "Is it a spirit?" The boy smiles in the dark. A grim, twisted smile that the world was never meant to see. He has made contact. He is no longer just the boy in the dark. He is the ghost of the Escorial, and soon, very soon, the king will die. And the brother, the twin, Charles, will take the throne. And Charles is weak. Charles is simple. Charles will need a guide. The boy in the wall looks at his hands. He looks at the scratches on the wall. He is ready. He will not rule with a crown. He will rule with a whisper, but communicating through a chimney is a fragile thing. A shift in the wind, a blocked grate, and the connection is lost. The boy knows he needs a better way. He needs to touch the world, and as he explores the limits of his prison, running his long, pale fingers along the floor near the food hatch, he finds something. A loose stone. Not a mistake by the mason, but a flaw in the geology of the rock itself. He begins to dig. Not out, but deeper. What he finds beneath the floorboards is not freedom, but a conduit. A way to send messages that are more permanent than air. The education of the ghost is over. The reign of the shadow is about to begin. In the late 17th century. A terrifying rumor began to circulate through the courts of Europe. Ambassadors from France and England sent encrypted letters back to their capitals, whispering that the King of Spain, Charles II, was not merely sick, he was possessed. Servants reported seeing the king standing alone in his private chambers, staring blankly into the dark mouth of the fireplace, engaging in long, heated conversations with the empty air. They said he asked questions about war, about taxes, about the loyalty of his generals. And then he would pause. He would tilt his head as if listening to a frequency that no one else could hear. And then he would nod. The church panicked. They sent exorcists. They sprinkled holy water on the hearth. They believed a demon was whispering in the king's ear, guiding the ruined empire toward destruction. But the exorcists were wrong. The voice wasn't coming from hell. It was coming from the wall. It wasn't a demon. It was a brother who had been erased from the family tree, but who had never left the building. While the king wore the crown, the prisoner in the wall wore the pants. The decisions that shaped the fate of millions were not made on the throne, but in a cold, dark cell, whispered through a chimney flue by a man who had never seen the sun. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let the tension of the conspiracy fade. Let the whispers dissolve into the comfortable silence of the night. We are safe here. The doors are locked. The candles are burning low. Let us return to the heart of the mystery. Let us travel back to the royal study of the Escorial Palace. It is a room of heavy velvet curtains, towering bookshelves, and the scent of old leather and burning oak. The year is 1675. King Charles II is 14 years old. Imagine him sitting there. The bewitched king. He is a boy who looks like an old man. His legs are weak, barely able to support his weight. His jaw is heavy, his speech slurred. He is the ruler of a global empire, yet he is the loneliest soul in Spain. He sits in a high-backed chair, wrapped in ermine furs to ward off the chill that seems to live in his bones. The fire in the great stone hearth crackles and pops, sending sparks up the chimney. To the architects, it was a way to expel smoke. To the king, it was a comfort. But to the boy on the other side of the wall, it was a telephone. We must understand the physics of this connection. The Escorial is built of granite. Sound travels poorly through thick stone. But the ventilation shafts, carved by the master masons decades earlier, were designed to create airflow. They acted like acoustic tubes. When the fire died down late at night, and the updraft settled, the channel became clear. The Shadow Prince, now also 14, sat on the other side. He was not weak. He was not confused. In the dark, his mind had sharpened into a razor. He knew the king was there. He could hear the rustle of the pages the king struggled to read. He could hear the weeping. Charles often wept. He wept for his weakness. He wept because he could not understand the complex documents his ministers forced him to sign. I do not know, ... Charles would sob into the silence. I do not know what they want from me. And one night the Shadow Prince decided to answer. He did not speak with kindness. He did not speak with brotherly love. He spoke with the cold, hard authority of someone who has nothing to lose. Read the third line, the voice rasped from the vent. Charles froze. He looked around the empty room. Who is there? The third line, the voice repeated. The tax on wool. It is too high. Charles stared at the fireplace. The voice was distorted, hollow, sounding like it came from a great distance or a great depth. To a superstitious boy raised on stories of saints and demons, there was only one explanation. Are you an angel? Charles whispered. In the dark cell, the Shadow Prince smiled. A thin, pale smile. I am the guardian, he replied. I am the one who watches. It was the perfect lie. It gave Charles comfort, and it gave the Shadow Prince power from that night on. The dynamic of the Spanish monarchy changed forever. The king was no longer alone. He had a secret counselor. A ghost council of one every evening after the ministers had left. Charles would dismiss his guards. Leave me, he would say. I must pray. But he wasn't praying. He was briefing his brother. Charles would read the state papers aloud, stumbling over the difficult words. The French ambassador ... demands ... concessions ... in Flanders. And from the cold darkness of the vent, the answer would come back, sharp and immediate. Refuse him. He is bluffing. His army is tied up in the Dutch wars. He cannot fight on two fronts? Charles would nod, his eyes wide with awe. Yes, you are right. You are always right. Think of the strangeness of this scene. The visible king, draped in gold, taking orders from the invisible prisoner. Naked in the stone, the Shadow Prince had never seen a map of Flanders. He had never seen a French soldier. But he had listened. For 14 years he had listened to every conversation in that study. He had absorbed the geopolitics of Europe through the chimney. He knew the personalities of the rival kings better than they knew themselves. He treated the world like a chess game played in the dark. He moved pieces he couldn't see. And Charles became addicted to the voice. It gave him confidence. When he walked into the council chamber the next day, he would repeat the words he had heard in the night. We will not yield to France, Charles would announce, his slur less pronounced, his back straighter. The ambassador is lying. The ministers were stunned. Your Majesty. How did you know? Charles would just smile, a mysterious, vacant smile. God speaks to me, he would say, and in a way he was right. The God of his personal universe was speaking. A God he had unknowingly sentenced to a living hell, but secrets, like roots, grow deep and tangled. The bond between the brothers was not just political. It became emotional. They were twins, separated by stone, yet mirror images of the same tragedy. Charles was the body without the mind. The Shadow Prince was the mind without the body. Together, they made one complete king. There were nights when they didn't talk of war. Nights when the rain lashed against the palace windows, and the weight of the crown felt too heavy to bear. "I am tired." "Guardian," Charles would whisper, leaning his head against the cold stone of the mantelpiece. "My head hurts. My legs, they do not work today." And the voice from the vent would soften. The Shadow Prince, shivering in his thin blanket, feeling the dampness of the cell seep into his own twisted limbs, would feel a strange pang of sympathy. "Sleep," the voice would say. "The pain is a test. We endure." "We?" Charles asked once. "Are you in pain too, spirit?" There was a long silence from the vent. "I carry the burden of the realm," the Shadow Prince replied. "Your pain is my pain." It was the closest he ever came to telling the truth. The Shadow Prince began to live vicariously through Charles. He would ask for descriptions. "Tell me," he would command. "What does the Queen look like today?" And Charles would describe her. "She wore blue velvet. She has pearls in her hair. She smells of ... of roses." In the dark cell, the Shadow Prince would close his huge black eyes. He would imagine the color blue. He would try to conjure the scent of a rose, though the only things he had ever smelled were stone, dust, and his own body. He was painting a world in his mind, using his brother's eyes as the brush, but as they grew older, the connection became dangerous. The Shadow Prince was becoming arrogant. His advice was becoming bolder. He started to demand things. "The Minister of Finance is stealing," the voice hissed one night. "Dismiss him." "But he is powerful," Charles stammered. "The court likes him." "He's a thief," the voice snapped. "Get rid of him, or the kingdom falls." Charles obeyed. He fired the minister the next day. The court was in an uproar. Who was advising the king? Who was whispering these radical ideas? The spies in the palace began to watch the king's study. They drilled small peepholes in the doors. They saw the king talking to the fire. They saw him nodding to the empty air. The rumor of madness began to spread. They didn't suspect a hidden room. That was too impossible. They suspected insanity, and this brings us to the most tragic irony of all. The only thing keeping the Spanish Empire from collapsing was the advice of the Shadow Prince. But the very act of receiving that advice, the talking to the walls, was convincing the world that the king was unfit to rule. The Shadow Prince was saving the kingdom. But he was destroying his brother's reputation. He knew it. And he didn't care. In the dark, morality looks different. Survival is the only virtue. Power is the only currency. The Shadow Prince had realized that as long as Charles was king. He was the puppet master. The ghost in the machine, but machines break. And Charles was a very fragile machine. As the year 1680 approached, the king's health began to fail rapidly. The seizures started. The hallucinations, the fainting spells. The Shadow Prince could hear it all. He heard the king fall to the floor. He heard the doctors rushing in. He heard the bleeding, the purging, the prayers. He sat in his cell, helpless. If Charles died, the connection died. If Charles died, the food might stop coming. For the first time since he was a baby, the Shadow Prince felt fear. Not for himself, but for the loss of his vessel. He pressed his face to the vent, desperate to offer one last piece of advice, one last strategy to cheat death. "Fight," he whispered. "Do not let them bleed you. Fight." But the room was full of doctors. The noise was too loud. The king couldn't hear. Him, the Shadow Prince, was screaming into a void. Instruction for AI, the retention bridge. Soften the voice to a whisper. Prepare the listener for the next phase of the mystery. The voices in the vent eventually fell silent. The king was taken to his sickbed, far away from the study, far away from the chimney. The Shadow Prince was alone again, but he had tasted power. He had tasted agency. He wasn't going to go back to being just a prisoner if the chimney was closed. He would find another way. He remembered the loose stone in the floor. He remembered the hollow space beneath it. He began to dig with renewed fury. His fingernails broke. His fingers bled. But he didn't stop. He wasn't digging for a way out. He was digging for something else. Something he had sensed vibrating in the deep foundations of the palace, a forgotten water channel. An echo chamber that reached further than just the king's study, the ghost, was about to expand his haunt. History is often written by the victors, but intelligence is often found in the victims. The tragedy of the Hapsburg dynasty wasn't just that they were genetically collapsing. It was that they threw away their only hope. While King Charles II, the boy on the throne, struggled to learn the alphabet at age 10, unable to focus, unable to understand cause and effect, his secret brother in the wall was undergoing the most unique education in human history. He had no books. He had no candle to read by. He had no tutors to guide his hand. But he had a mind that was starving. And a starving mind will devour anything it is fed. Through a trick of acoustics in the palace ventilation system, the Shadow Prince didn't just hear the king's complaints. He heard the tutors. He heard the diplomats. He heard the generals. And because he was locked in total sensory deprivation, he didn't just listen, he memorized. He built a cathedral of knowledge in the dark, constructing a perfect model of a world he was forbidden to see. The king was the ruler of Spain, but the prisoner was the brain of Spain. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let the heavy iron gates of the mind close against the noise of the outside world. We are returning to the silence, to the deep, cool stone of the Escorial. Imagine a library. Not a library of wood and paper, but a library of air and echo. The year is 1670. The Shadow Prince is 9 years old. In the royal schoolroom. 2 floors above, the young King Charles is having a lesson. The royal tutor, a Jesuit priest with a patient voice, is pointing to a map of Europe. "This is France," the tutor says, tapping the parchment. "It is our rival." Charles stares at the map. To him, it is just colored shapes. He is bored. He is tired. He plays with the lace on his cuff. He doesn't listen, but deep below, in the space between the walls, another student is in session. The Shadow Prince is sitting cross-legged on the cold slate floor. His head is tilted back, his large, black eyes fixed on the darkness of the vent. He cannot see the map. He cannot see the colors. But he hears the word France. He repeats it silently, France. He imagines what a France is. In his mind, devoid of images, concepts become shapes. France feels sharp to him. It feels like the cold draft that hits his shoulder in winter. Spain feels heavy, like the stone he leans against. He listens as the tutor explains the border conflicts. He hears the names of rivers, the Rhine, the Danube. He creates a mental geography. He doesn't know what a river looks like. He has never seen water flow, other than the condensation on the wall, but he understands the concept of flow. He understands that a river is a barrier. This was the shadow education. It was an education of pure abstraction. While other children learned by seeing, by looking at pictures of horses, or ships, or castles, the Shadow Prince learned by deduction one afternoon. The tutor was explaining the Spanish Armada to the king. He spoke of ships with tall sails and cannons that thunder like storms. The Shadow Prince listened. Ship, sail, cannon. He had seen a spider web. He imagined a sail was like a giant web that caught the wind. He had heard the thunder of the storm on the night of his birth. He imagined a cannon was a machine that made the sky scream. His understanding of the world was surreal, dreamlike, but mathematically perfect. He didn't know what a ship looked like, but he understood the physics of wind. He didn't know what a soldier looked like, but he understood the logistics of hunger and supply because he had no distractions, no toys, no windows, no playmates. His focus was absolute. Modern psychologists call this deep work, the ability to focus without interruption. The Shadow Prince lived in a state of permanent deep work. He learned Latin by listening to the daily Mass chanted in the chapel, the sound drifting through the stone. He decoded the grammar, Dominus, Deus, Rex, Master, God, King. He realized that the language of the church was a code of power. He learned mathematics by listening to the royal treasurer, arguing with the king. We have 3 million ducats in debt, Your Majesty. The interest is 5%. In the dark, the Shadow Prince calculated the interest. He divided the ducats. He found errors in the treasurer's math before the treasurer did. He scratched the corrections into the stone wall with his flint, scritch, scritch. The wall became his blackboard. It was covered in formulas and lists of verbs and the names of foreign queens. Imagine the tragedy of this scene. The genius child, sitting in filth, writing the secrets of the empire on the inside of his own tomb, while the chosen child upstairs fell asleep during his lessons. The Shadow Prince became a collector of sounds. He learned to identify the specific footsteps of the cleaners. He knew which maid was having an affair with which guard just by the hushed giggles and the rustle of clothing in the corridor. He knew which minister was drinking too much wine by the slur in his voice. During the morning briefings, he built a psychological profile of the entire court. He knew who was lying. He knew who was ambitious. He knew who was afraid, and most importantly, he knew his brother. He heard Charles weeping. He heard Charles praying for strength. He heard the vulnerability in the king's voice that no one else was allowed to hear. The Shadow Prince didn't just learn facts. He learned empathy, but it was a cold, strategic empathy. He learned that his brother was a vessel, a tool. Charles was the body. He was the mind. There is a concept in philosophy called Plato's cave. It describes prisoners who are chained in a cave facing a blank wall. They see shadows cast by a fire behind them, and they believe these shadows are the real world. The Shadow Prince was the ultimate prisoner of the cave, but his shadows were made of sound. He began to wonder about the light. He heard the word constantly. Sunlight, daylight, starlight. He asked himself, what is light? He knew the dim, yellow glow that came through the food hatch. It hurt his eyes. It was sharp and burning. Was the sun a giant lamp that burned the whole world? He tried to visualize it. He imagined the world outside the wall was a place of blinding white fire where people walked around burning. It frightened him. He preferred the dark. The dark was safe. The dark was cool. In the dark, he was the master. As he reached adolescence, his education shifted from passive to active. He began to anticipate the lessons when the tutor asked, "What is the capital of Portugal?" The Shadow Prince would whisper the answer to the spider before the king could stutter a reply. "Lisbon," he would hiss. And 10 seconds later, the tutor would say, "It is Lisbon, Your Majesty." The Shadow Prince would smile. He was faster than the king. He was smarter than the king. He began to feel a sense of superiority. The monster in the wall realized that the real monsters were the ones who were stupid. This confidence changed him. He stopped curling into a fetal position. He sat with his back straight, his head held high in the darkness. He moved with a strange, fluid grace. He was no longer a discarded refuse of the Hapsburg line. He was its apex. He was the culmination of generations of breeding, but instead of physical deformity, the genetic roll of the dice had given him a deformed genius. A brain that was too big for its cage, and like any student who outgrows his classroom, he began to yearn for a test. He didn't want to just listen anymore. He wanted to apply what he had learned. He looked at his scratched calculations on the wall. He looked at the map of Europe he had drawn in his mind. He realized that the tutor was wrong about France. He realized that the treasurer was wrong about the debt. The errors of the outside world began to irritate him. It was like hearing a musical instrument being played out of tune. He needed to fix it. He needed to reach out. And so the shadow education came to an end, and the shadow rain began. He moved to the ventilation shaft. He cleared his throat, a sound like dry leaves. Crinkling, he waited for the silence in the study above. He was about to graduate, but knowledge is a dangerous thing in the hands of the forgotten. The Shadow Prince had learned the laws of man, but he had never learned the laws of the heart. He knew logic, but he did not know mercy. As he prepared to whisper his first command to the king, he didn't realize that he was starting a chain of events that would not only save the empire. But damn his brother's soul, the voice in the wall was about to speak. And the world was about to listen. In the annals of medical history, there is no patient more tortured than King Charles II of Spain. They called him El Hechizado, the Bewitched. The world believed that his frailty, his seizures, and his madness were the result of a curse placed upon him by sorcerers in the pay of the French court. But the true curse wasn't magic. It was a misunderstanding so profound it destroyed a man's soul. When the king began to speak to thin air, when he began to scream that voices were whispering secrets of state into his ear, the church did not look for a hidden room. They looked for a hidden devil. For 20 years, the most powerful man on earth was subjected to a regime of holy torture. Exorcists poured oil into his mouth. Doctors placed freshly killed pigeons on his head to draw out the vapors. They tied him to his bed while priests chanted over him, demanding the demon reveal its name, and all the while, the demon was sitting 10 feet away behind a wall of granite, eating bread and listening to his brother scream. The Shadow Prince tried to stop it. He tried to whisper comfort. But every time he spoke, the king screamed louder, convinced that hell itself was opening up. The king was not possessed by Satan. He was possessed by a secret he wasn't allowed to know. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let the echoes of the screams fade into the velvet silence of the past. The air grows still. The heavy scent of incense and dried lavender settles over the room. We are far away from the pain now. We are observers, drifting through the corridors of time like smoke. Let us look upon the man himself, Charles II, the last. Hapsburg, he stands by the window of the royal study, looking out at the gardens of the Escorial. He is a figure of immense sorrow. His legs are thin and trembling, barely able to hold the weight of his silk breeches. His jaw, the heavy inheritance of his ancestors, hangs open, making it difficult for him to speak without slurring. He is 30 years old, but he looks like an old man. His hair is white and brittle. His skin is like parchment paper, dry and cracking. To the court, he is a figure of pity and contempt. They call him an idiot behind his back. They say his mind is as empty as his nursery, but we know the truth. We know that Charles is not empty. He is full. He is full of a presence that is too big for his fragile body. Imagine the psychological weight of his life. He has been told since birth that he is God's anointed ruler. Yet he cannot walk without stumbling. He cannot chew his food. He cannot read a treaty without his head throbbing in pain. He feels like a mistake. But then there is the voice. For years, Charles believed the voice in the chimney was an angel, a divine guardian sent to help him rule. It was his only comfort. When the ministers shouted at him, confusing him with numbers and demands, he would retreat to his study. He would sit by the fire, trembling. "Guardian?" he would whisper. "Are you there?" And the voice would answer, deep, calm, certain. "I am here, Charles. Tell me what they said." And Charles would pour out his heart. He would tell the voice everything, and the voice would fix it. The voice brought order to the chaos, but as Charles grew older, the relationship became more complex. The voice began to sound ... angry. The voice began to demand things that frightened Charles, and then came the seizures. The doctors called it epilepsy. But consider the timing. The seizures often happened when the shadow prince was agitated, when the brother in the wall was pacing his cell. Furious at some political blunder, Charles would collapse in the council chamber. Foaming at the mouth, it was a sympathetic resonance, a connection of blood that defied science. The court physicians, baffled by his condition, turned to the supernatural. "It is a hex," the Grand Inquisitor declared. "The king is bewitched." And so began the tragedy of the cure. To cure a man of bewitchment in the 17th century was a brutal affair. They did not use medicine. They used theology. They isolated Charles. They took away his books. They filled his room with relics, bones of saints, fragments of the cross, vials of holy oil. They brought in the exorcists. Imagine the scene. The room is dark, lit only by flickering candles. The king is strapped to a chair. A priest stands over him, sprinkling holy water that burns like acid on his raw skin. "Exiergo, transgressor." The priest shouts, "Get out, transgressor." Charles weeps. "I hear him," he cries. "I hear the voice. He is angry." The priest nods grimly. "Yes, the demon is resisting. We must pray harder." And on the other side of the wall, the shadow prince is listening. He hears his brother's torture. He hears the Latin chants. He understands exactly what is happening. For the first time, the genius in the wall feels helpless. He realizes that he is the demon. Every time he tries to help Charles, he only confirms the diagnosis. He tries to stay silent. He vows not to speak, but silence is hard when your other half is screaming. One night, during a lull in the exorcisms, the king sat alone in his study. The priests had gone to sleep, exhausted by their battle with the invisible enemy. Charles was broken. His spirit was crushed. He stared at the cold ashes in the fireplace. "Demon?" Charles whispered, his voice cracking. "If you are a demon, why do you help me?" There was a long silence. The wind howled down the chimney. Then a whisper came. So soft it was almost indistinguishable from the draft. "I am not a demon, brother." Charles froze. "Brother? I am the shadow cast by your light." It was a riddle, a poetic truth spoken by a man who had never read poetry. Charles didn't understand. He thought it was another trick of the devil. He began to weep again. "Leave me! Leave me be!" In the wall, the shadow prince leaned his forehead against the cold stone. He felt a tear run down his own cheek, a tear that no one would ever see. He realized then that he could not save Charles. The wall between them was too thick, not just the granite, but the wall of superstition. The Shadow Prince made a decision. A decision of cold logic. If speaking hurt the king, he would stop speaking. He would withdraw. He would let Charles rule alone, but the withdrawal had a catastrophic effect. Without the Shadow Prince's guidance, Charles fell apart. The next day, in the council meeting, the king was lost. He couldn't remember the names of his ministers. He signed the wrong treaties. He gave away territories in the Caribbean to the Dutch without realizing it. The empire began to bleed. And physically, Charles withered. Without the connection, without the symbiotic link to his stronger twin, his life force drained away. He stopped eating. He spent his days wandering the halls of the Escorial, touching the tapestries, murmuring to himself. "He is gone," Charles would say to the servants. "The guardian has left me." The court nodded knowingly. "The exorcism worked," they said. "The demon is cast out." But they were wrong. The demon wasn't cast out. He was just holding his breath. The Shadow Prince sat in the dark, starving himself in sympathy with his brother. He listened to the decline. He heard the slow, shuffling footsteps of the king growing weaker every day. He knew the end was coming, and he knew that when Charles died, the secret would be in danger. The bewitched king was not a victim of magic. He was a victim of a lie told by a father who couldn't accept a deformed son. A lie maintained by a court that preferred superstition to truth. Charles II lived his life as a puzzle with a missing piece. He never knew that the piece was right there, just inches away. As the king lay on his deathbed in the year 1700, the room was filled with weeping and prayers. The Shadow Prince, now a man of 39, sat in his cell, waiting. He felt the moment the king's heart stopped. He felt a sudden coldness in his own chest. A severance. The link was broken. Charles was free, but the Shadow Prince was now truly alone, and in the silence that followed the king's death, a new question arose in the darkness. Who would feed the ghost now? The funeral of King Charles II was grand. The bells of Madrid rang for 3 days, but while the world watched the coffin being lowered into the royal crypt, a small, unnoticed drama was playing out in the servants' quarters. The mute servant, the only one who brought food to the wall, had died of the same fever that took the king. There was no one left who knew the secret. The food hatch remained closed. The water stopped coming. And inside the wall, the council in the dark was about to hold its final session. Historians have always been baffled by the miracle years of King Charles II. For a brief period in the 1680s, the bewitched king, a man who could barely tie his own shoes, suddenly began making brilliant strategic decisions. He outmaneuvered the French Navy. He reformed the tax code of Castile. He silenced the rebellious nobles in Catalonia. The world asked, who is advising the king? The official records list a council of state composed of 12 dukes and cardinals. But the records are a lie. The true council did not meet in the gilded hall of mirrors. It met in the dark. It had no table, no chairs, and no clerks. It consisted of exactly one member. The Shadow Prince, locked in his stone box, had evolved beyond being just a listener. He had become a simulator. In the total sensory deprivation of his cell, he split his mind into fragments. He became the treasurer. He became the general. He became the admiral. He held debates with himself in the dark, arguing all sides of a war, calculating every outcome, until he distilled the chaos of the empire into a single, perfect whisper. The king was the puppet, but the prisoner was the puppeteer, pulling strings made of stone and silence. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let the clamor of the court fade away. Let the heavy wooden doors of history close softly, shutting out the noise of the world. We are left in the quiet. The kind of quiet that feels heavy, like a warm blanket pulled up to your chin. We return to the hidden room behind the western wall. But we are not looking at a prisoner anymore. We are looking at a master at work. Imagine the Shadow Prince sitting in the center of his cell. He is 20 years old now. His body is twisted, yes. His skin is pale as moonlight. But his presence is commanding. He sits with his eyes closed, rocking slightly back and forth. To an observer, he might look like he is in a trance. But inside his mind, a storm is raging. He is running a simulation. He has heard through the vents that the grain harvest in Andalusia has failed. He knows the peasants are starving. He knows the nobles are hoarding wheat. In his mind, he summons the council. He imagines the voice of the greedy Duke of Alba. He imagines the voice of the pious archbishop. He plays out the argument. He whispers to the empty air, mimicking the deep baritone of the general. We must send the army to seize the grain. Then he answers himself in the high, scratchy voice of the treasurer. But the army needs bread to march. We cannot afford it. He is playing chess with himself. But the pieces are human lives. This mental elasticity is what kept him sane. If he had been just one person, the loneliness would have killed him. So he became many. He filled his small, dark room with a cast of thousands. He paced the 10 feet of his cell, back and forth, dragging his bad leg. Scrape, step, with every turn he solved the problem. By the time he reached the ventilation shaft, he had the solution. He waited for the night. He waited for the king to sit by the fire. "Brother," the whisper would drift up the chimney. "The grain, yes?" The king would reply, his pen hovering over the paper. "What must I do?" "Do not seize the grain," the Shadow Prince would command. "Lower the tax on import. Let the Portuguese sell to us. The price will drop." It was simple economics. But to the king it was prophecy. But there is a cost to holding the world in your head. The Shadow Prince was not sleeping. His mind was constantly whirring like a clock that has been wound too tight. He began to mutter to himself constantly. If you had stood in the corridor outside, pressing your ear to the hidden wall, you would have heard a low, continuous drone. It sounded like a hive of bees. But it was just one man debating the fate of millions. He began to lose track of where the simulation ended and reality began. He started to believe that he was Spain, that the stone walls of his cell were the borders of the country, that the rats scurrying in the corner were his subjects. He gave orders to the spiders. He negotiated treaties with the shadows and the king. The king became just another piece on the board. Charles was no longer a brother to be loved. He was an asset to be managed. "Guardian," the king would weep during the bad nights. "I am afraid." And the Shadow Prince, exhausted by his mental labor, would feel a flash of irritation. "Fear is inefficient," he would hiss. "Do not be afraid. Be king." It was a cruel instruction. How can a man be king when he is hollow? The tragedy of the council in the walls is that it worked too well. The Shadow Prince saved the empire, but he destroyed the humanity of the men involved. He turned his brother into a robot, and he turned himself into a machine. There were nights when the Shadow Prince would touch the cold stone and wonder what it felt like to be wrong, to make a mistake, to be human. But he couldn't afford mistakes. Mistakes meant discovery. Mistakes meant death. So he continued to calculate. He continued to whisper. He was the greatest statesman Europe never knew. A genius buried in a tomb, ruling a world of light from a throne of darkness. But even the most perfect machine needs fuel. The council in the Walls relied on one thing, the connection. The thin, fragile thread of air that linked the chimney to the cell. But what happens when the fire goes out? What happens when the king gets too sick to come to the study? As the year 1700 approached, the Shadow Prince noticed a change. The king's voice was getting fainter. The meetings were becoming shorter, and then one day the mute servant brought the food tray, and his hands were shaking. The council was about to be dissolved. Not by a vote, but by the silence of the grave, in the great hall of the Escorial. The banquets were legendary. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted boars, pheasants glazed in honey, and towers of marzipan. Wine from La Rioja flowed like blood into crystal goblets. Courtiers gorged themselves until they were sick. But the king could not eat. His deformed jaw made chewing a torture. He watched the food with sad, hungry eyes while his courtiers feasted. But there was another hunger in the palace. A hunger that was hidden, secret, and desperate. Every night, while the kitchen staff slept, a single plate was prepared. It was not a plate of scraps, but a plate of the finest cuts, the breast of the pheasant, the softest white bread soaked in broth. This was not food for a dog. This was food for a prince. But it was delivered like a secret shame. There was no royal procession, no trumpets, just a shadow moving through the silent corridors, carrying a silver tray to a wall that looked solid. The Hapsburgs believed they were feeding a dark spirit to keep it appeased. But they weren't feeding a spirit. They were feeding a man who had been reduced to an animal, waiting in the dark for the only kindness the world ever showed him, the slide of a stone and the smell of warm meat. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let the noise of the banquet hall fade into the distance. The candles have burned down. The music has stopped. The palace is wrapped in the heavy blanket of the night. We are walking down the service corridors now. The stone is cold underfoot. The air smells of damp earth and old limestone. We are following the footsteps of the keeper. He is the mute servant, the man with no tongue. The only soul in Spain allowed to approach the forbidden wall. It is a ritual, a holy duty performed in the profane dark. He carries the tray with steady hands. The silver gleams in the faint light of his lantern. He moves silently, his soft-soled shoes making no sound on the granite. He is a ghost feeding a ghost. He reaches the section of the wall behind the great tapestry of the hunt. He sets the lantern on the floor. The light casts long, dancing shadows that seem to reach out like fingers. He pulls the lever hidden behind the velvet. Clack. The sound is heavy, mechanical. It is the sound of a stone grinding against stone. A sound that has echoed in this corridor for 30 years. A square of darkness opens up. The servant does not look inside. He has learned that looking is dangerous. Looking invites pity, and pity is a weakness. He simply places the tray on the stone ledge, and then he waits. He listens to the silence of the palace breathing around him. He counts the beats of his own heart, and then he hears it. The shuffle. It is the sound of bare skin dragging across slate. It is a slow, painful sound. The occupant of the room does not walk. He crawls. Years of confinement, of crouching in a box too small for a grown man, have twisted his limbs. The Shadow Prince moves like a spider, fluid and low to the ground. The servant stares at the wall opposite him. He does not turn his head, but he can feel the presence. He can smell the stale, metallic scent of the cell. It is the scent of a tomb that has not yet been sealed. Hand reaches out from the black square. It is a hand that defies description, pale as bone. The fingers are impossibly long, the nails grown into curved claws that click softly against the silver tray. It is a hand that has never touched a human being, never held a flower, Never felt the warmth of the sun. It clutches the tray with a sudden feral strength. Clink. The tray disappears into the dark. The servant lets out a breath he didn't know he was holding. For the next 20 minutes he stands guard. He is the sentinel of the meal. From inside the wall, the sounds of eating begin. They are not polite sounds. There is no etiquette in the dark. There is only the primal need to survive. The chewing is wet and hurried. The shadow prince eats as if the food might be snatched away at any moment. The servant closes his eyes. He imagines the boy who became the monster. He wonders if the prince knows what he is eating. Does he know that this wine comes from the king's own cellar? Does he know that this bread was baked for the royal table? Or is it just fuel, coal for the furnace of his mind? Sometimes when the eating stops, there is a moment of stillness. The tray is pushed back out, empty, licked clean, but sometimes the hand lingers. The long, pale fingers rest on the stone ledge, waiting. The servant knows what this means. It is a request. Not for food, but for contact. The shadow prince wants to know that there is another living being on the other side of the wall. He wants to feel the heat of a human presence. The servant hesitates. He is forbidden to touch the prisoner. He is forbidden to communicate, but the silence of the night is heavy, and the servant is lonely too. Slowly, tentatively, the servant reaches out. He places his own rough, calloused hand near the ledge. He does not touch the prince. He just places his hand there, inches away. The heat radiates between them. The warmth of the worker meeting the cold of the prisoner. They stay like that for a minute. Two men bound by a secret that is heavier than the stone blocks around them. One who cannot speak and one who cannot be seen. Then the fingers in the dark retract. The moment is over. The servant pulls the lever. Clack. The stone slides back into place. The line is sealed. The wall becomes solid again, hiding the sin of the Hapsburgs. The servant picks up the empty tray. It feels lighter now, but his heart feels heavier. He walks back down the corridor, the lantern swinging by his side. He leaves the shadow prince in the dark with a full belly and an empty soul. The feeding continued for decades. It was the only clock the shadow prince had. Meal to meal. Tray to tray, but biology is cruel. A body kept in the dark, fed on rich meats and wine, without exercise, without sunlight. It begins to rot from the inside. The shadow prince was not just suffering from his deformity anymore. He was getting sick. And the king was getting suspicious. The church had started to ask questions about the extra food disappearing from the kitchens. The Inquisition was sniffing around the cellars. The servant knew that the routine was fragile. One mistake, one wrong turn, and the wall would be breached. And deep in the wall, the shadow prince sensed it too. He felt the change in the air. He tasted the fear in the bread. He knew that the feeding would not last forever. And he knew that when the food stopped, the screaming would begin. In 1685. The most dangerous eyes in Europe turned their gaze toward the walls of the Escorial. They did not belong to a foreign spy or an assassin. They belonged to the Holy Office of the Inquisition for centuries. The Inquisition had burned heretics, tortured Jews, and silenced scientists. They claimed to hunt for the enemies of God, but in reality, they hunted for secrets. And the royal palace was leaking secrets like a sinking ship. The Grand Inquisitor, a man named Mendoza, did not believe in the king's bewitchment. He was a man of cold logic. He didn't look for demons in the air. He looked for numbers in the books. And the numbers didn't add up. Mendoza found a discrepancy in the royal kitchen ledgers. Every night for 20 years, a meal fit for a nobleman disappeared. It was never served at the high table. It was never given to the poor. It simply vanished into the western wing. Mendoza knew that ghosts do not eat roast pheasant. Demons do not drink vintage wine. He concluded that someone was hiding in the palace. A lover? A spy? A heretic? He didn't know it was a prince. But he knew that where there is smoke, there is fire. And he prepared to burn the wall down to find the truth. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let the fear of the judgment fade. Let the crackle of the flames die down into the comfortable warmth of a hearth. We are safe here. We are merely witnesses to the past, watching from the shadows. Imagine the corridors of the Escorial at night. They are long stone arteries, pulsing with the silence of the sleeping court. But tonight there is a new sound. The rustle of heavy silk robes. The click of rosary beads against a wooden cross dot. It is the sound of the Inquisition walking the halls, the Grand Inquisitor. Mendoza was a shadow within a shadow. He was a tall man, gaunt as a skeleton, with eyes that seemed to have no eyelids. He rarely slept. He believed that sleep was a weakness, a time when the devil could enter the mind. So he walked the perimeter of the king's chambers. He walked the service tunnels. He touched the walls, sensing the vibrations of the building. Mendoza was a bloodhound. He could smell guilt. And the western wing smelled of guilt. He had been watching the mute servant for weeks. He saw the sweat on the servant's brow when he carried the silver tray. He saw the way the servant's eyes darted left and right. Checking for observers, Mendoza did not intervene. Not yet. The Inquisition is patient. They do not strike until the trap is perfect. He stood in the alcove, hidden by the darkness. Watching the servant disappear behind the tapestry of the hunt, he waited. He timed it. 20 minutes later, the servant reappeared with an empty tray. Mendoza smiled in the dark. A joyless, thin smile. He approached the wall after the servant had gone. He ran his long, pale fingers over the tapestry. He felt the texture of the woven threads, the hunters, the stags, the blood. It was a violent image covering a silent crime. He pressed his ear against the fabric. Silence. But then a sound. Cough. It was a wet, heavy cough. The cough of a man whose lungs are filled with damp of the earth. Mendoza froze. A ghost does not cough. He realized then that the bewitched king was not the only tragedy in this palace. There was something else. Something living. Something that breathed and ate and suffered. Mendoza did not tear down the wall immediately. He was a politician as well as a priest. He knew that the king's secrets were dangerous to touch. If he exposed the king's shame without proof, he could be executed for treason. So he began a game of cat and mouse. He doubled the guards in the western corridor. He placed his own agents in the kitchens. He ordered that the food for the night shift be reduced. He wanted to starve the secret out. Inside the wall, the Shadow Prince felt the tightening of the noose. The food tray that arrived the next night was lighter. There was no wine. The bread was stale. The Shadow Prince understood. He had listened to the footsteps outside. He knew the heavy, confident stride of the Inquisitor. He knew he was being hunted. For the first time in years, the Shadow Prince felt the terror of his childhood return. He retreated to the furthest corner of his cell, curling into a ball. He stopped scratching on the walls. He stopped moving. He tried to become stone, but the Inquisition does not stop at physical walls. They attack the mind. Mendoza began to hold prayer services in the hallway right outside the hidden room. He would stand there with 3 other monks, chanting psalms of judgment at the top of their lungs. God sees all. Mendoza would thunder, his voice penetrating the granite. There is no rock that can hide the sinner. Come forth. Imagine the psychological torture. The Shadow Prince, huddled in the dark, hearing the voice of God's executioner just inches away, calling him a sinner. He didn't know what sin he had committed. He didn't know why he was hidden. He only knew that the men in black wanted to hurt him. The king, Charles II, was too sick to protect him. The mute servant was too powerless. The Shadow Prince was alone against the most terrifying organization in history. And as the chanting grew louder, vibrations shaking the dust from the ceiling of his cell, the Shadow Prince made a mistake. He let out a whimper, a high, thin sound of pure animal fear. Outside, the chanting stopped instantly. Mendoza held up his hand. The monks fell silent. "Did you hear that?" Mendoza whispered, his eyes gleaming in the torchlight. "It sounded like a child, Your Eminence," one monk replied. Mendoza nodded slowly. He looked at the wall. He looked at the tapestry. He knew he didn't need a door. He knew where the heart of the mystery lay. Mendoza turned to his monks. "Bring the masons," he ordered quietly. "Bring the sledgehammers. We have a wall to inspect." But tearing down a wall in the royal palace requires permission or an accident. Mendoza decided he would not ask the king. He would stage a renovation. He would claim the foundation was cracking. He would break the seal, but before the first hammer could swing, something happened that stopped the Inquisition cold. A scream ripped through the palace. Not from the wall, but from the king's chamber. The connection between the brothers was about to strike one final, terrifying blow. The Shadow Prince was in danger, and the king was about to feel every ounce of that fear. It was the sound that shattered the soul of Spain. On the night of All Hallows' Eve, 1695, the Grand Inquisitor raised his hand. The masons lifted their iron sledgehammers, ready to breach the western wall. Inside the stone cell, the Shadow Prince crouched in the dark, his eyes wide with an animal panic. He felt the vibration of the threat. He opened his mouth, unused to volume, and released a scream of pure, unfiltered horror. At that precise second, 3 floors above, King Charles II was sitting at a banquet. The king suddenly stood up, his eyes rolling back in his head. He clutched his chest and he screamed. It was not a separate sound. It was an echo. A perfect, terrifying synchronization. The king fell to the floor, convulsing, shouting, "They are breaking me! Stop them!" The Inquisitor heard the king's voice echoing down the stone shafts. He froze. The masons lowered their hammers. The realization struck them with the force of a physical blow. The life of the king and the life of the prisoner were one. To strike the wall was to commit regicide. The hammer never fell. The secret survived, protected by a bond of blood and pain that defied all logic. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let the echoes of that terror fade into the velvet silence of the past. The heart slows its frantic rhythm. The room grows still, and the shadows lengthen, wrapping us in a blanket of calm. We drift away from the edge of fear, floating back into the deep, quiet river of time. The palace of El Escorial is a living organism. When one part shivers, the whole structure trembles. Imagine the silence that descended upon the corridor after the scream. It was heavy, thick with dust and unasked questions. The masons packed away their tools with trembling hands. They did not speak. They did not look at the wall. They simply fled, leaving the Inquisitor alone in the dark. Mendoza stood there for a long time. He touched the stone. He felt the cold radiation of the mystery. He understood now that some doors are sealed not by mortar, but by destiny. He turned and walked away. The hunt was over. Inside the cell, the Shadow Prince lay curled on the slate floor. His breathing was shallow. The darkness of the cell felt softer now, less like a prison and more like a womb. He did not know that his terror had been his salvation. He only knew that the pounding had stopped. The silence returned, wrapping around him like a protective cloak. Upstairs, the king was carried to his bed. The doctors administered drops of laudanum, sending him into a deep, dreamless slumber. The connection between the brothers had acted as a psychic lightning rod, grounding the danger, saving them both. For a moment, the universe held its breath. The twins slept. One in a bed of silk, one in a bed of straw. Both safe. Both broken, but safety is an illusion in a crumbling empire. The scream had drained the last reserves of the king's vitality. The bond had saved him tonight, but it had also weakened him. The silence of the palace was not peace. It was the quiet before the final collapse. The king would not scream again. He would only fade. Here is the immersive, high-retention sleep story script for subtitle Thirden. The king dies. The brother remains. I have locked the target. Exactly 400 words. I will generate this in one part. Within this single response to ensure smooth continuity without stopping, November 1st, 1700, the day the Spanish sun finally set. King Charles II took his last breath, his body ravaged by the genetic sins of his ancestors. The autopsy revealed a heart the size of a peppercorn and a head full of water. The court wept. The bells rang. The dynasty ended. But amidst the chaos of a dead king, the world forgot the living ghost. The most terrifying moment wasn't the death itself. It was the silence that followed for the other brother. When the king died, the mute servant, the only link to the hidden room, fled the palace, terrified of the coming war. There was no one left to pull the lever. No one left to bring the tray. The Shadow Prince was not killed by the plague. He was sentenced to the cruelest death imaginable, oblivion. He waited for a dinner that never came, listening to his brother's funeral procession, realizing he had been buried alive. This is the truth, the king buried ... now. Let the tolling of the heavy funeral bells drift away on the cold winter wind. The black crepe is draped over the mirrors. The candles flicker and die, one by one. The palace grows cold, settling into the long, dark sleep of history ... Imagine the solitude of that final week. For 39 years, the brothers were connected by blood and stone. When Charles exhaled his final breath, the Shadow Prince felt the severance like a physical blow, a sudden, absolute chill in the dark. He sat on his cold slate floor, waiting for the familiar vibration of the servant's footsteps. He waited for the grinding sound of the stone mechanism, but the corridor outside remained silent. The palace was in mourning, distracted by the politics of succession. Hours turned into days. The hunger returned, sharp and demanding, gnawing at his ribs. He scratched at the wall with his long nails, but there was no answer. The darkness, once his friend, now closed in like a fist. He was the last living remnant of a fallen house. A breathing artifact trapped within the masonry ... as the hunger turned to weakness. The Shadow Prince lay down on the stone, closing his eyes, and the long, slow wait for the final silence began. The history books described the funeral of Charles II as a moment of global mourning. Emperors wept. Nations trembled. But 10 feet away, behind a wall of cold granite, the true tragedy was unfolding in absolute silence. The Shadow Prince did not die in battle. He did not die of old age. He died of abandonment. When the mute servant fled, the lifeline was cut. There was no water. There was no bread. There was only the dark. Imagine the psychological terror of those final days. The Shadow Prince waited. He listened to the footsteps of the servants clearing out the king's chambers, unaware that a living soul was clawing at the stone just inches from their heads. He realized with a clarity that only the dying possess that he was not a man to them. He was a secret, and secrets are meant to be buried. As the thirst took hold, he did not scream. He simply used his last ounce of strength to scratch one final word into the floor, a testament to a life lived in the shadows, before the darkness finally swallowed him whole. This is the truth the king buried ... Now, let the sharp edges of that pain dissolve. Let the dust of 3 centuries settle over the scene, softening the harsh lines of history. The room is quiet now. The struggle is over. We are drifting into the deep, timeless peace of the stone itself ... In the end, there was no pain, only a drifting away. The cold of the Escorial is legendary. It seeps into the bones, preserving them, turning flesh into something like parchment. As the Shadow Prince lay down on his slate bed for the last time, the frantic beating of his heart began to slow. Thump. Thump ... Thump, matching the slow, rhythmic dripping of the condensation in the vent. He closed his large black eyes. The darkness, which had been his prison, now became his blanket. He became part of the architecture. No longer a Hapsburg. No longer a prince. Just another shadow in a building made of shadows. The palace moved on, forgetting him, leaving him suspended in the amber of time ... For 300 years, the room remained sealed. The air inside grew stale and still. But the story was not over. The wall was solid, but stone is not eternal. The modern world was coming, bringing with it lights and lasers that would finally pierce the dark. For 300 years, the western corridor of the Escorial was just a hallway. Tourists walked past it. Kings walked past it. Cleaners dusted the tapestry that hung there, never knowing what lay inches behind the fabric. But in 2018, the silence was finally broken. A team of structural engineers was scanning the palace foundations for water damage using ground-penetrating radar. They expected to find solid granite. Instead, the monitor flashed red. It showed a void. A perfect 10 by 10 square of emptiness suspended in the masonry. There was no door recorded on any blueprint. There was no entry point. When they drilled the first borehole and lowered a fiber optic camera into the darkness, the team fell silent. The light of the camera didn't reveal a ventilation shaft. It revealed a chair, a small, child-sized chair covered in the dust of ages, facing a wall that had been scratched away by human fingernails. The king didn't just hide a room. He hid a life. This is the truth the king buried ... Now, let the hum of the radar fade. Let the bright lights of the modern world dim. We step back from the shock of the new, returning to the stillness of the old. The dust settles and the silence returns, wrapping us in the heavy, comforting velvet of history ... Imagine the moment the masonry was finally breached. It was not violent. It was surgical. A single stone, carefully removed by the restorers. As the seal was broken, a rush of air escaped. It was air from the 17th century, trapped in a time capsule of stone. It smelled of dry earth, of ancient wool, and of a solitude so deep it felt heavy on the lungs. The torchlight swept across the floor, illuminating the slate tiles that had been polished smooth by the pacing of bare feet. There were no bones. Time and the damp conditions had claimed the physical form of the Shadow Prince. He had returned to the dust from which he came. But the room was not empty. It was filled with the echoes of a mind that had once ruled an empire from the dark. The scratches on the walls were not random. They were calculations, maps, a testament to a genius who had no voice. but as the camera zoomed in on the stone floor near the ventilation shaft, it revealed one final heartbreaking detail. A message carved not in anger, but in longing. A set of marks that told the final secret. The most haunting discovery in the hidden room wasn't the darkness, it was the floor. When archaeologists finally cleared the heavy dust from the slate tiles in 2018, they found no white bones. The physical remains of the shadow prince had turned to dust centuries ago, reclaimed by the damp earth. But he left something behind that refused to fade. Deeply carved into the granite near the ventilation shaft, worn down by decades of frantic, desperate scratching, was a single word repeated over and over again in the stone. It wasn't a curse on his family. It wasn't a plea for mercy. It was the word hermano, brother. In his final moments, starving and alone in the absolute dark, the monster didn't hate the king who imprisoned him. He missed him. The Hapsburg dynasty ended in madness and ruin, but the truth they buried was far simpler. They broke a sacred bond of blood, and in doing so, they shattered their own souls. The empire fell not because of wars, but because of a lie. This is the truth the king buried ... Now, let the dust settle back onto the stone. The discovery is made, the secret is out, and the history books are finally closed. We step back from the sharp edge of tragedy into the comforting shadows of the night, where all stories eventually find their rest. The air is still, and the heart is calm. The Escorial palace still stands today, a gray mountain against the Spanish sky. The tourists walk the halls, admiring the tapestries, unaware of the empty space that lies just inches away. The Shadow Prince is gone, his suffering dissolved into the ether of time. The silence in the room is no longer heavy. It is peaceful. It is the silence of a long sleep after a hard life. The walls no longer hold him prisoner. They merely hold his memory. The scratching is no longer a cry for help, but a permanent mark of existence. He was here. He lived. And now he rests. The darkness is no longer a cage, but a soft, velvet shroud covering the past as the wind howls through the Guadarrama Mountains tonight. It carries no whispers, no secrets, only the soft, rhythmic lullaby of the past. You are safe in the light. The story is done. Drift into a deep, dreamless sleep.